Section 1. The animation errors when Springfield forgot what it looked like. Let's start somewhere comfortable. You're watching The Simpsons. It's a Sunday night, or maybe it's 3 in the morning and you've lost track of time completely, which is fine. That's what this is for. The couch gag plays. The family slides into position. Homer gets flattened. Maggie pops up with a squeak. And then the episode begins, and somewhere in the next 22 minutes, something happens that the animators in South Korea probably noticed and flagged and was either ignored or missed entirely by the time the episode reached a television screen in your living room. That's what we're here for. Not the deep conspiracies. Not the fan theories that reframe the entire show as a dying man's fever dream. Not the dark subtext about radiation and class warfare and the systematic destruction of the American working family. All of that is genuinely fascinating, but it requires a certain amount of mental energy, and tonight we're not doing that. Tonight we're going to sit with 4 hours of beautiful, harmless, occasionally baffling production errors that accumulated across 36 seasons of one of the most watched television programs ever made. We're going to notice things that were always there, sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to pause the frame and say, "Wait, something is wrong with this picture." And then we're going to move on. Because in Springfield, you always move on. The Simpsons has been in production since 1989. 36 seasons, 788 episodes at the time of this script, with more arriving on schedule. When you produce that volume of animated content across that span of time, across multiple studios, multiple generations of artists, multiple transitions in production technology from hand-drawn cells to digital animation, errors are not a question of if. They are a question of how many and how strange. The answer, as it turns out, is a lot and very strange. Let's begin with the most fundamental category of animation error, the character who is simply in the wrong place. This happens more often than you might expect in a show where the locations are largely fixed. Springfield has the same school, the same bar, the same church, the same nuclear plant, the same diner. These are not locations that change dramatically from episode to episode. And yet, across the show's run, characters have routinely appeared in locations where they cannot possibly be. Not because of plot, not because of teleportation, but because an animator placed them in the background of a scene they weren't supposed to be in, or because a character who was confirmed to be somewhere else ended up in a crowd scene 3 blocks away in the same episode. Season 3 gives us one of the earliest examples. In the episode Stark Raving Dad, which is the one where Homer ends up in a mental institution alongside a large white man who believes he is Michael Jackson, there is a scene set at the Springfield nuclear power plant. Several background characters are visible at their workstations. The issue is that one of those background characters is Lenny, who in the same episode, in scenes that occur within minutes of this one, is shown to be at home, not nearby, at home. The show established his location. The background animator did not get that memo, or did not consult the episode's layout, or simply needed a body to fill a seat and reached for the nearest recognizable face. This is the most innocent version of the error, and it runs through the entire series like a quiet thread. The more entertaining version is when characters appear in crowd scenes during events they could not logically attend. Springfield holds a lot of public gatherings, town hall meetings, riots, parades, sporting events, school performances. These scenes require large numbers of background characters, and the animators, working under time pressure, fill them with whoever is available in the character library. Which means that in crowd scenes at Springfield Elementary School events, you will occasionally spot adult characters who have no children, no connection to the school, and no reason to be in a gymnasium watching a third-grade talent show. They're just there, standing in the crowd, looking mildly interested in a child's saxophone performance. Sideshow Bob appears in the audience of at least 2 separate Springfield events in episodes where he is canonically in prison. Not escaped. Not on a furlough. In prison, as confirmed by other scenes in the same episodes. And yet there he is in the background, arms folded, wearing his distinctive teal prison garb, watching whatever Springfield has gathered to watch. The animators grabbed him from the character library and placed him in the scene without checking whether his character was currently incarcerated. Principal Skinner appears in a crowd outside Springfield Elementary, in an episode where his own storyline has him inside the school for the entire duration. He is in 2 places at once. The external crowd scene was animated separately from the interior scenes, and nobody cross-referenced them before the episode aired. The cloning problem is related to this but distinct. Cloning is when the same character appears multiple times in the same scene, not because the show is making a joke about it, but because the background animator copy-pasted a figure to fill space and forgot that the same figure was already present 12 pixels to the left. You can find instances of this in almost every season of the show. A crowd at a sporting event will contain the same mustachioed man standing 4 feet apart from an identical version of himself. They're wearing the same clothes, they have the same posture, they're making the same expression. Neither of them notices the other because neither of them is supposed to be there twice. Season 5 has a particularly memorable instance during a town meeting scene. 3 separate attendees in the background rows are identical. Same bald head, same green shirt, same slightly confused expression. They're seated at different points in the crowd, which means they were placed independently rather than duplicated from a single position, which somehow makes it worse. Someone drew this man, placed him in the scene, and then 2 other artists working on the same shot also drew this man and placed him in the same scene, and nobody looked at the assembled image and said, "There are 3 of this person." Now let's talk about Springfield's architecture, which is one of the show's most delightful ongoing sources of continuity horror. The Simpson family home at 742 Evergreen Terrace is one of the most recognized fictional residences in television history. Most people could sketch its rough layout from memory. The yellow exterior, the large tree in the front yard, the detached garage, the porch. The interior has a living room, a kitchen, a staircase, a basement, an attic, and bedrooms for every family member. It is a specific, well-established location. It is also a location that has subtly and not so subtly changed its dimensions, layout, and internal geography dozens of times across the show's run. The most discussed example involves the staircase. In early seasons, the staircase in the Simpson home is positioned in a specific relationship to the front door and the living room. Characters enter through the front door, and the staircase is visible to the right or sometimes behind them depending on the camera angle, leading to the upper floor. This arrangement is consistent for a number of seasons. Then it starts to drift. The staircase moves. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make you slam your coffee down in shock, but gradually and persistently in a way that, if you were to track it across episodes, produces a staircase that has migrated through the interior of the house like a very slow tectonic event. By later seasons, the staircase appears to begin in a location that is simply incompatible with where it was in earlier seasons if you treat the house as a real 3-dimensional object. Which you shouldn't, because it's a cartoon. But the show invites you to treat it as consistent and then declines to honor that invitation. The basement is its own special case. The Simpson basement is reached via a door in the kitchen, and it has appeared in dozens of episodes as a setting for various plots. The problem is that the size of the basement fluctuates enormously depending on what the episode needs it to contain. In some episodes, it's a cramped, low-ceilinged utility space, barely large enough for the water heater, and some forgotten holiday decorations. In other episodes, it's a cavernous, almost warehouse-scale space capable of containing elaborate machinery, large gatherings of people, and on one occasion what appears to be a functioning indoor basketball court. These are not subtle variations. The basement of the Simpson home oscillates between being roughly the size of a walk-in closet and the size of an aircraft hangar, depending entirely on narrative necessity. The same applies to Bart's bedroom. In the show's early seasons, Bart's room is small, close, slightly cramped in a way that feels accurate to a child's bedroom. There's a bed, a window, a small desk, some scattered belongings. As the series continues, Bart's room grows. It acquires space that cannot be accounted for by the house's exterior dimensions. Windows appear on walls that would face the interior of the house rather than the outside. The layout of the room shifts between episodes to accommodate whatever scene needs to play out in it. By the middle seasons, Bart's bedroom is approximately the size of a studio apartment in a major American city, which is substantially larger than the room in which his parents sleep. Lisa's bedroom has its own separate architectural inconsistency, which is that its position relative to Bart's room changes across the series. In some episodes, they appear to share a wall, their rooms adjacent to each other at the top of the stairs. In other episodes, there appears to be substantial space between their rooms, enough that sound doesn't carry between them, enough that the hallway between their doors is long enough to stage entire conversations in. The second floor of the Simpson home is, in practical terms, larger than the first floor of the Simpson home, which is larger than the footprint of the house as seen from the exterior. This is the Simpson family's home. the most frequently depicted location in the entire series, and it has never, not once across 788 episodes, had a consistent internal layout. The exterior of the house has its own quirks. The large tree in the front yard, which is one of the most recognizable elements of the establishing shot, has changed species at least twice. In early seasons, it has the silhouette of one type of tree. In later seasons, it's clearly a different shape, a different species, drawn by animators who either weren't given a reference image or were given one that didn't match the original. The tree also moves slightly on the lot, creeping forward or backward relative to the house depending on the episode, a phenomenon that is probably attributable to different artists drawing the establishing shot from memory rather than from a master reference. The garage is another frequent victim. In some episodes, the Simpsons have a fully functional garage attached to their home. In other episodes, the garage appears to be converted into a different kind of space, or to have disappeared entirely, replaced by a side wall of the house. Homer's car sometimes lives in the garage, and sometimes lives in the driveway, and occasionally lives in neither, simply materializing at the curb when the plot requires a car. The nuclear power plant that employs Homer is perhaps the most heavily depicted workplace in animation history, and it has the continuity to match. The plant's cooling towers, its most recognizable exterior feature, are visible from most elevated vantage points in Springfield in some episodes, and invisible in others despite the building presumably not having moved. The plant's interior changes so dramatically between episodes that it functions less as a real building and more as a flexible narrative space that the writers configure to suit whatever storyline Homer is stumbling through this week. The control room where Homer works, Sector 7G, has had its walls, its windows, its emergency equipment, its console layout, and its relative position within the building altered across dozens of episodes in ways that would make a real architect weep quietly into their blueprints. The school, Springfield Elementary, has a campus that expands and contracts with the same cheerful disregard for physics as the Simpson home. Classrooms appear and disappear. The cafeteria has been in at least 3 different locations within the building, depending on the episode. The hallways are sometimes narrow and institutional, sometimes broad enough to accommodate large-scale set pieces. The auditorium, which is used for school plays and assemblies and various Springfield community events, is in a different position relative to the school's main entrance in every episode that depicts both elements in the same establishing shot. The town of Springfield itself as a whole cannot be mapped. This is a feature rather than a bug, as discussed in deeper Simpsons analyses, but from a pure production standpoint, it generates a constant stream of small errors. In one episode, Moe's Tavern is around the corner from the Simpsons' home. In another episode, it takes Homer a substantial drive to get there. The Quickie Mart is close to the school in some episodes and close to the power plant in others. The church and the town hall switch relative positions. The cemetery is on one side of town and then on another. Springfield's internal geography is not a consistent space. It is a collection of locations that the writers and animators arrange in whatever relationship serves the current episode's needs, and then rearrange for the next one. One of the most charming categories of animation error involves character appearance errors in scenes where no plot logic explains the inconsistency. These are the moments where a character simply looks different from how they looked 10 minutes earlier in the same episode, and the difference cannot be attributed to anything other than the fact that different animators handled different scenes. Marge's pearl necklace is a prime example. The necklace is one of Marge's defining visual characteristics, as recognizable as her tower of blue hair. It appears in virtually every scene she's in. It is, in the logic of the show, simply part of how Marge looks, and yet it disappears. Not dramatically, not in episodes where the plot addresses her losing it, but quietly, in individual scenes, in the middle of episodes where it has been present before and will be present again. A close-up of Marge at the kitchen sink will show a bare neckline. Pull back to a wider shot and the necklace is back. The close-up animator didn't include the necklace. The wide-shot animator did. Nobody caught the discrepancy before the episode aired. Homer's stubble follows a similar pattern. Homer's face has a distinctive blue-gray stubble shadow that is part of his design, one of the visual shorthand elements that makes Homer look like Homer. This shadow is inconsistently applied across the series. In some scenes, Homer has it. In adjacent scenes in the same episode, he doesn't. It disappears in close-ups and returns in wide shots, or disappears in wide shots and is present in close-ups, with no pattern that corresponds to time of day or narrative logic. Homer simply sometimes has stubble and sometimes doesn't, within the same episode, and occasionally within the same scene. The color of clothing worn by background characters changes between shots with remarkable frequency. A character in a red sweater in one shot will be in a blue sweater in the next shot, and back in red for the shot after that. This isn't a costume change. The character hasn't left the room. It's an inconsistency between shots animated by different people who had different reference materials or no reference materials at all. In crowd scenes, where background characters are less carefully tracked, this happens constantly. The same unnamed townsperson will cycle through 2 or 3 outfit colors within a 2-minute sequence. Then there are the mouth errors, which are a special category unto themselves. The Simpsons is an animated show, which means every piece of dialogue requires animating a character's mouth to match the words being spoken. This is called lip sync, and it is one of the most labor-intensive parts of animation production. The Simpsons, across its run, has had a lot of lip sync errors. Characters whose mouths move before the dialogue begins. Characters whose mouths continue moving slightly after their line ends. Characters whose mouths open for a line that, in the final audio mix, is delivered by someone standing off-screen. Characters whose mouths move with a slight but perceptible delay relative to the words you're hearing, creating the impression that you're watching a very slightly mistranslated version of a show you've seen 100 times. The early seasons handled this largely through traditional animation, where the lip sync was drawn by hand and timed carefully. The later seasons moved to digital animation workflows, which introduced their own categories of timing error. Characters in the digital era sometimes have mouths that snap open and closed with a mechanical precision that doesn't quite match the organic rhythm of human speech. Lines that should sound relaxed and conversational are accompanied by lip movements that look like someone running through a phonetic exercise. There's also a category of error that might be called the impossible object, which is when something appears in a scene that cannot logically be there, not because of character placement but because of the scene's physical logic. A glass that was empty is full again without anyone having refilled it. A door that opened inward now opens outward in the reverse angle shot. A table that was between 2 characters has vanished, allowing them to stand closer together than the previous shot's blocking permitted. A window that was dark is now bright with daylight, in a scene that is established as taking place at night. These errors are small. They are, individually, completely inconsequential. They don't affect the story. They don't change what the characters are saying or doing. They are, in the most literal sense, background noise. And yet there's something genuinely pleasant about finding them, because finding them means paying close attention to something that was made with enormous effort by a lot of people working very hard and discovering the human fingerprints in the machinery. Every animation error is evidence that a real person sat down and drew this, and that person was working fast, or was tired, or had an unclear reference, or made a judgment call that didn't quite match the judgment call made by the person who drew the preceding shot. The Simpsons is not a perfect object. It never was, and there is something deeply relaxing about that. Section 2. The Continuity Catastrophes. When Springfield forgot what happened last week. Here's the thing about continuity in a television series. It requires someone to keep notes. Not complicated notes, just a record of what has been established. This character's name. That character's job. The location of that specific building. What this person knows about this other person. The basic architecture of the world you've built so that when you return to it next week, or next season, or 6 years from now in a flashback, you're returning to the same place. The Simpsons kept some notes. There was, for much of the show's run, a continuity document and a writing staff attentive enough to catch most major contradictions before they aired. But across 36 seasons and hundreds of writers who rotated through the staff, and the fundamental structural reality that the show was designed with episodic independence as a feature rather than a flaw, continuity errors accumulated anyway. They accumulated quietly and steadily and sometimes spectacularly, and they form one of the most entertaining archives in American television. Let's begin with Santa's Little Helper, the greyhound the family adopted in the show's very first regular episode, and whose history became increasingly complicated the longer the show ran. Santa's Little Helper is introduced in Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, the first episode, as a racing greyhound who finishes last in a race and is abandoned by his owner. Homer and Bart take him home. He becomes the family dog. This is clean, clear, and well established. The problems begin with Snowball. Snowball is the family cat. In the first episode, she is referred to as Snowball the Second, which implies there was a previous cat, Snowball the First, who has died before the series begins. This backstory is consistent and referenced across multiple episodes. There was a Snowball 1, she died, the family got Snowball 2, then Snowball 2 dies in season 13, hit by a car driven by Dr. Hibbert's car. The family goes through a series of replacement cats in quick succession, each named something different, until Lisa names the final replacement cat Snowball 2 as well, on the grounds that this makes things simpler. This is played as a joke about the family's pragmatic approach to pet loss, and it works as a joke. But here's where the continuity starts to fray. In episodes after Snowball 2's death and replacement, the show occasionally references or depicts a cat in the Simpson home that is not clearly the new Snowball named Snowball 2, but might be the original Snowball 2, or might be a different cat entirely. Background shots of the house sometimes include a cat whose coloring doesn't match any clearly established cat. The show treats the cat as interchangeable background furniture in a way that occasionally produces scenes where the cat's identity is genuinely ambiguous. Santa's Little Helper's markings are inconsistent across the series, in a way that can be attributed partly to different animators working from different reference images. The specific pattern of his coloring, the exact shape of his spots, the precise length and curl of his tail, all of these fluctuate. These are small variations, and they don't affect anything the show does with the character narratively. But if you watch episodes across different seasons back to back, you're watching a dog who is recognizable as Santa's Little Helper, while also subtly not being exactly the same dog. The more narratively significant continuity issue with Santa's Little Helper is his intelligence. The show depicts Santa's Little Helper as varying enormously in cognitive ability depending on what the episode requires. In episodes focused on his perspective, he displays emotional intelligence, loyalty, something approaching genuine problem-solving ability. In other episodes, he's a completely unremarkable dog, doing completely dog things. He's had training that makes him remarkably capable in some episodes, and been shown as completely unresponsive to basic commands in others. This isn't a contradiction in the way an animation error is a contradiction, because dogs genuinely do vary in behavior. But the degree of variation in Santa's Little Helper's presented abilities across the series is wide enough to make him feel like multiple different dogs wearing the same coat. Homer's educational history is a continuity catastrophe spread across the full run of the show. In the early seasons, Homer is established as a high school graduate who attended Springfield High School. His academic career there is referenced several times. He met Marge there. He graduated. He went on to work a series of jobs before landing at the nuclear power plant. This is the baseline. Then the show begins adding to this. Homer, it turns out, also attended Springfield Community College for a period. He took night classes. He got a degree in something at some point. He also attended Springfield University in at least one episode, though his attendance there is complicated by the plot of that episode. He has, across various flashback episodes, been depicted as having dropped out of different educational institutions at different points for different reasons. The result is a version of Homer's educational history that is genuinely impossible to reconcile into a single coherent timeline. He has too many periods of schooling for his age. He has graduated and failed to graduate from too many institutions, and the sequence in which these things happened shifts depending on which episode you're watching and which writer was working on it that week. His employment history before the nuclear plant is similarly tangled. The show has established, across multiple flashback episodes, that Homer held somewhere between 12 and 30 different jobs before landing at the plant. Some of these jobs appear in the same period of his life and would have been impossible to hold simultaneously given their locations and schedules. Some of them seem to take place before events that are established as happening at an earlier point in his life. Homer's pre-plant employment history is not a timeline. It's a collection of set pieces that each work independently and collapse immediately when placed next to each other. The marriage of Homer and Marge is perhaps the show's most notoriously retconned event. In the early seasons, Homer and Marge's courtship and marriage are presented as having occurred in the early 1980s. They met in high school, they dated, Marge got pregnant with Bart, they got married because of that pregnancy. This is a specific, emotionally grounded backstory that was revisited in several beloved flashback episodes in the show's peak seasons. As the floating timeline advanced the show's present into subsequent decades, this backstory became mathematically impossible. If Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s in 2005, they cannot have gotten married in 1980 because they would have been children. So, the show began quietly adjusting. Flashback episodes set their high school years later and later. The cultural touchstones of Homer and Marge's youth shifted from 1970s references to 1980s references to 1990s references to 2000s references. Grunge replaced disco. Early internet replaced payphones. Their courtship started happening against different cultural backdrops, while the emotional beats of the story remained identical. The issue is that the show didn't do this systematically. Different episodes moved the timeline forward by different amounts at different times. The result is that if you assemble all of the flashback episodes that show Homer and Marge in high school or early in their relationship, you get a collection of scenes that are set across approximately 3 different decades. Marge's prom dress is appropriate for the 1970s in one flashback and appropriate for the 1980s in another. Homer's hair references different musical eras. The cars parked on the streets of their teenage Springfield are from different model years in different flashback episodes. The couple has been married at least twice in show continuity, which is a separate issue from the timeline drift. In one episode, a comedic complication reveals that their original marriage ceremony was somehow invalid and they have to remarry. They remarry. The marriage is reestablished. And then the show proceeds as though the original marriage was valid all along, because the continuity between episodes is not airtight enough to enforce the implications of the second ceremony. Other episodes reference their wedding anniversary in ways that are incompatible with both the original marriage and the remarriage. Grandpa Abe Simpson's military service is a continuity disaster of truly impressive scale. In the show's early seasons, Grandpa is established as a World War II veteran. This is one of his core character traits, one of the most frequently referenced elements of his backstory, and the source of most of the jokes about his tendency to ramble about the past. He fought in the war. He was part of the greatest generation. He has stories. As the show continued, Grandpa's wartime service began expanding. He had served in the Pacific Theater. He had also served in the European Theater. He was present at events that took place in theaters of the war that are geographically incompatible, in the sense that a soldier present at a specific action in the Pacific, in a specific month, could not also have been present at a specific action in Europe in the same month. Grandpa accumulated enough wartime experiences to have served in approximately 3 different wars simultaneously, which he effectively did. Given that the show also began inserting him into the Korean War, and eventually into Vietnam, despite Grandpa's established age making his presence in Vietnam, at the time of that conflict something of a biological stretch. The show is not really interested in Grandpa's military service as a coherent factual history. It's interested in it as a comedic device, a way to generate rambling stories about the past that trail off before reaching a point. But the accumulated weight of those stories produces a character whose biography is, on its surface, about as internally consistent as a conspiracy theory written by someone who fell asleep halfway through their own note-taking. Patty and Selma, Marge's sisters, have an age relationship with Marge that the show has handled with creative flexibility across its run. They are established as older than Marge, which is consistent, but how much older has varied significantly. In some episodes, the age gap suggests they were born significantly before her, making them substantially her seniors. In other episodes, the gap seems narrower. The show's floating timeline interacts with their established seniority in ways that produce different impossible mathematics at different points in the series. Their shared backstory with Marge in childhood produces its own continuity puzzles. Flashback scenes involving the 3 sisters as children don't maintain consistent age gaps between them. In some childhood flashbacks, Patty and Selma appear to be only a year or 2 older than Marge. In others, the gap looks like 4 or 5 years. These are not large differences, but they're visible, and they accumulate across the many flashback episodes the show has produced to paint a picture of a family whose ages relative to each other shift depending on the story being told. Ned Flanders' wife Maude, and the manner in which the character was handled after her death, produces one of the show's most noticeable continuity awkwardnesses. Maude Flanders was killed in the episode Alone Again, Natura Diddley in Season 11. The episode was made necessary because the voice actress who played Maude, Maggie Roswell, had left the show following a dispute over compensation. Her character was killed off. This happens in television. Actors leave and characters are written out. The continuity problem is not the death itself. The continuity problem is that Maude Flanders exists in a show that doesn't always honor its own event history, and her absence is handled with varying degrees of consistency across subsequent seasons. In some episodes, Ned's status as a widower is central to his storyline and treated with genuine care. In other episodes, Maud is referenced casually in ways that feel inconsistent with the emotional weight the show gave her death. And in certain background moments, in crowd scenes and town gatherings, a character who appears to be Maud Flanders will appear in the background, standing in the crowd, despite Maud being canonically dead for that portion of the show's timeline. These background appearances are almost certainly the result of animators using older crowd templates that hadn't been updated to reflect Maud's departure from the living. The character library still contained Maud, and when background crowd scenes were being assembled, she was drawn in without anyone checking whether her presence made sense given current continuity. The recurring characters whose professions change between episodes form their own quiet category of continuity error. Dr. Nick Riviera is established as a spectacularly unqualified physician whose medical license is at best a creative document, and whose specific credentials are referenced differently across the episodes he appears in. His backstory has him graduating from different medical schools in different episodes. The nature and extent of his incompetence, while always substantial, fluctuates based on what the episode needs him to do, ranging from a doctor who is merely negligent to one who appears to have had no medical training whatsoever. Lionel Hutz, the ambulance-chasing lawyer voiced by Phil Hartman, had a running thread of continuity errors related to his bar membership, the status of his law license, and the specific nature of his disbarment, which seems to have occurred at different points and for different reasons depending on which episode you're watching. In some episodes, he appears to be currently licensed. In others, he has clearly lost his license and is practicing illegally. In others, still, he has somehow regained a license through processes the show declines to explain. The character of Principal Skinner, separate from the enormous and deliberately executed continuity rupture of The Principal and the Pauper, has numerous smaller continuity errors embedded in his history. His time in Vietnam, the specifics of his capture and imprisonment, the details of his relationship with his mother Agnes, all of these elements are referenced across multiple episodes and don't always align. The show uses Skinner's military past as a source of character texture rather than as a precisely maintained factual record, which produces a history that works emotionally but falls apart if you try to write it as a biography. Burns's age, as discussed in various deep analyses of the show, is a continuity catastrophe the show has committed to, and then abandoned, and then recommitted to across its entire run. He is established as very old, exactly how old changes constantly. The specific historical events he personally witnessed shift between episodes. The show uses Burns's age as a source of comedy, which means the comedic requirements of each individual joke take priority over maintaining a consistent birth year for the character. The result is a man who appears to have been born somewhere between the 1840s and the 1880s, depending on which episode you use as your reference, and who has personally witnessed everything from the American Civil War to the moon landing to events that would require him to have been alive for approximately 160 years. The show is fine with this. The continuity is not the point. But if you're watching carefully, and watching is all we're doing tonight, these accumulated inconsistencies paint a picture of a world that has been assembled by hundreds of different people over 3.5 decades, each of whom brought their own understanding of what Springfield is and how it works, and not all of whom were working from the same set of notes. Number. Section 3. The Timeline Disasters. When Springfield's past stopped making sense. There is a category of mistake that is unique to long-running television, and it is the mistake of the backstory that was written without anyone asking how old this character will need to be in 15 years. The Simpsons committed this mistake early, and continued committing it with remarkable consistency. The show's characters were given specific ages in the early seasons. Those ages were tied to specific historical events, specific cultural moments, specific years in which things happened, and then the floating timeline moved the present forward, while the characters stayed the same age, which meant that the historical events in their backstories moved forward too, which meant the backstories had to be rewritten, which meant the backstories contradicted themselves. This is the fundamental structural challenge of the floating timeline, and it produces a specific category of error that is worth examining in detail, not because it changes anything about the show, but because tracing it is like following a river upstream to find out where the water came from. Homer Simpson was born on a date the show has specified in multiple episodes, and those dates do not agree with each other. The earliest, clearest statement of Homer's birth date comes from his driver's license, which appears in several early episodes. The license shows a specific date. That date, combined with the year of the show's early seasons, makes Homer's age consistent with the presented mid-30s characterization of the character. Later episodes reference Homer's birth date in contexts that place it in a different year, not dramatically different, a few years, but enough to produce a measurable inconsistency if you're trying to construct a timeline. The show eventually stopped presenting Homer's precise birth date with the same specificity, because specificity was the enemy of a floating timeline, and instead leaned into a vaguer characterization of Homer as a man in his late 30s or thereabouts, which gave the writers more flexibility. But the earlier specific dates are still in the show. They're in episodes that air in syndication constantly, and they don't agree. Bart's birth date is even more contested. Several episodes establish the month and day of Bart's birthday. The year is occasionally stated. The year changes between episodes. The show has at various points implied that Bart was born in years that would make him younger or older than 10 depending on when you're watching, which doesn't affect the show's reality, because the show's reality holds that Bart is simply and permanently 10 years old, but which produces a quiet impossibility in the background of certain scenes. The famous flashback episode I Married Marge from Season 3 establishes a specific and detailed account of how Homer and Marge got together, where they were living, what was happening in the outside world, and how long it had been between the beginning of their relationship and the birth of Bart. This timeline was internally consistent when it aired in 1991. The problem is that the year in which the flashback is set, visible in the cultural details of the episode, places Bart's birth in a year that has become inconsistent with later episodes that either moved the flashback's era forward or placed Bart's birth at a different point. The Way We Was, from Season 2, covers similar ground with slightly different details. Both episodes are beloved. Both episodes depict the origins of Homer and Marge's relationship. And both episodes, watched back to back, reveal inconsistencies in that history that are probably attributable to the fact that they were written in different seasons by different writers who had access to the same general outline, but were filling in specific details independently. In The Way We Was, Homer and Marge's first meeting occurs in high school during a detention session. The cultural backdrop is the early 1970s. This is consistent with the characters being in their early to mid-30s at the time of the show's original airing. In I Married Marge, the courtship is placed in a period that references slightly different cultural touchstones, and the specific timeline of their early relationship has details that don't perfectly map onto The Way We Was. The shows are telling the same story roughly, but the specifics don't quite line up. As the show produced more and more flashback episodes through subsequent seasons, this problem compounded. Each new flashback was a new opportunity to either confirm or slightly contradict what had been established before. And the show, which was not primarily interested in maintaining a perfect historical record, but in producing funny and emotionally resonant episodes, made the choice that any individual writer would make. They told the story in the way that worked best for the episode they were writing, and the continuity document would sort it out. Except the continuity document, however diligently maintained, cannot retroactively resolve contradictions that have already aired. The question of when Homer started working at the nuclear power plant is similarly muddy. In some tellings, Homer began at the plant shortly after Bart's birth, needing stable employment to support his family. In other tellings, Homer had been at the plant for some years before Bart was born. In still others, Homer came to the plant through a specific sequence of events that places his first day of employment at a point that doesn't reconcile cleanly with either of the previous versions. The plant has been Homer's workplace for the entirety of the show's run, and the story of how he came to be there has been told enough times, with enough variations, that no single authoritative version exists. Homer's mother, Mona's departure from the family, has its own timeline complications. She left when Homer was approximately 6 years old, according to the episode that first introduced her. But the specific year of her departure, as implied by the cultural events depicted in the flashback showing her radicalization and subsequent flight, doesn't consistently match a Homer who was 6 years old in that year, given the various contradictory birth years for Homer established across the series. This is a small discrepancy in absolute terms, but it's the kind of thing that becomes visible when you're watching attentively. Grandpa Abe Simpson's past relationship with Burns is another source of timeline complexity. The show has established, in a later season episode, that Grandpa and Burns had a prior relationship involving a deal that protected Homer's employment. The timing of this deal, relative to Homer's birth and Grandpa's age and Burns's age, and the general historical timeline of Springfield, produces a set of dates that require creative accounting to make consistent. The show doesn't do that accounting. It presents the emotional truth of the situation and trusts the audience to follow the character dynamics without checking the math. Krusty the Clown's father, Rabbi Hyman Kristofsky, is introduced in the episode Like Father, Like Clown, a Season 3 episode that won an Emmy. Rabbi Kristofsky rejected Krusty for choosing show business over religious life. The episode ends with their reconciliation. It's a genuinely moving episode. In later seasons, Krusty's relationship with his father is referenced in ways that are inconsistent with the resolution of that episode. The estrangement is referenced as ongoing in contexts where it should have been resolved. The reconciliation is effectively forgotten in episodes where a continuing estrangement serves the story better. The character of Rabbi Kristofsky himself returns in later seasons, played by a different voice actor after the original died, and the continuity of his relationship with Krusty across those appearances is inconsistent with both the original episode and with itself. When Krusty's father eventually died in the show in a later season episode, it produced a moment that was emotionally effective, but which sat in complicated relationship with the fact that their reconciliation had already happened much earlier, and had then been quietly walked back to allow for future stories about their conflict. Sideshow Bob's history with Krusty and the specific timeline of his various incarcerations and escapes is a continuity problem that grew more complex with every season that added a new Sideshow Bob episode. His crimes escalated, his imprisonments accumulated, his escapes became more elaborate, and the timeline of when he was in prison and when he was not became impossible to track linearly. In some episodes, he references having been imprisoned for a specific length of time. In others, the implied duration of his incarceration doesn't match. The joke of Sideshow Bob's repeated escapes and reconvictions functions episodically, each new episode being its own self-contained story, but the cumulative record of his criminal history is a document that only makes sense if you agree not to try to read it chronologically. The Flanders family's history in Springfield is another source of quiet timeline errors. Ned Flanders and Homer are presented as neighbors who have lived next door to each other for a long time. The specific duration of their neighborly relationship is stated differently in different episodes. In some episodes, they have been neighbors for most of Homer's adult life, since shortly after he moved into the house on Evergreen Terrace. In other episodes, the implication is that Ned moved in more recently, or that their relationship as neighbors began at a different point. The backstory of their neighbor dynamic, which includes various stories about past interactions, conflicts, and moments of connection, doesn't form a perfectly coherent history when assembled across all the episodes that reference it. The Springfield retirement home, where Grandpa lives for most of the series, has its own timeline oddities. The facility has been destroyed, damaged, rebuilt, and relocated in various episodes, but subsequent episodes often treat it as undisturbed and in its original location. Its administration has changed across the series in ways that aren't consistently tracked. The specific conditions of life there, and the roster of other residents, fluctuates in ways that are probably best understood as the show treating the retirement home as a recurring backdrop rather than a consistently maintained fictional institution. Apu's history with the Quick E-Mart, and specifically the timeline of his immigration and naturalization, has been addressed across multiple episodes with details that don't always align. His academic history in India and in America has been mentioned in various contexts with details that shift. His relationship with his family in India and the circumstances of his arranged marriage to Manjula have backstory elements that are referenced differently in different episodes. The recurring joke about Apu holding multiple advanced degrees, including a doctorate in computer science, is one of those character details that becomes slightly unstable when viewed across the full run of the show, because the specific institutions he attended, the timing of his education, and the relationship between his educational history and his immigration history are filled in with details that are internally consistent within individual episodes, but don't form a perfectly consistent cross-episode biography. What all of these timeline disasters have in common is that they are the product of a show that was never designed to maintain a tight factual history, and that ran long enough for the absence of that tight history to become visible. The writers of The Simpsons were primarily writing comedy and character drama. They were not primarily writing historical documents. When a flashback episode needed Homer's past to contain a specific detail, the writer used the detail that served the episode, and the consistency with other episodes was a secondary concern. This is not a criticism. It's just what happens when a show runs for 36 years. The sediment accumulates. The layers don't always line up. And if you look at them from the right angle, in the right light, in a quiet room late at night, they tell a story that is stranger and more interesting than any single episode's plot. Number. Section 4. The background character blunders, Springfield's forgotten people. Springfield is a town of approximately 30,000 people, depending on which episode you use as your source, and a significant fraction of those people are recurring background characters who appear across the series with enough regularity to have been given names by the production team and by the dedicated fan community that has cataloged them. Over the decades, these background characters are the furniture of Springfield. They fill the crowd scenes, they populate the school hallways, they sit in the booths at Moe's, they line the bleachers at Springfield Isotopes games. They are present in nearly every outdoor scene, nearly every public space scene, nearly every episode, and because they are so omnipresent, and because they are treated as interchangeable by the production in ways that major characters are not, their continuity errors are both the most frequent and the most interesting. Hans Moleman is the most famous example, and his situation is unusual enough to deserve extended attention. Hans Moleman is a small, elderly-appearing, extremely myopic background character who first appeared in Season 2 and who has since become one of the show's most beloved background presences. He has a name, a voice, and a recurring role as the universe's preferred target for escalating misfortune. He gets hit by cars, he gets struck by lightning, he gets buried, he gets crushed, he gets electrocuted, he gets eaten. And then he appears in the next episode as if none of this happened. The show has killed Hans Moleman, by various counts, somewhere between dozens and scores of times. The exact count depends on whether you count deaths in Treehouse of Horror episodes, deaths in dream sequences, deaths that are implied but not shown on screen, and deaths in episodes where Moleman appears and is clearly dead, but this fact is not addressed. On a conservative count that limits itself to canonical non-dream episodes where Moleman is clearly shown to die or is explicitly stated to have died, the number is substantial. On a broader count, it becomes remarkable. None of these deaths has ever been addressed in a subsequent episode. There is never a reference to Moleman's death in the episode following one in which he died. There is never an acknowledgement that this man has a remarkable tendency to not stay dead. He simply reappears. Ready? Slightly confused. Wearing his familiar coat. The continuity error here is different in character from most of the errors discussed in this section, because Moleman's deaths are clearly a running joke rather than a production mistake. But the joke is itself a kind of continuity error committed intentionally and repeatedly, which makes it interesting in a different way. The show is deliberately creating a continuity impossibility and then declining to resolve it, which in the context of a show that also produces accidental continuity errors, produces a blurring of the line between mistake and intention. Moleman's stated age is 31 years old. He is visually depicted as a man who appears to be in his 80s or 90s. The show has offered no explanation for this discrepancy. The most common fan reading is that something, radiation being the popular candidate, has aged him catastrophically. But the show itself simply presents both pieces of information, his stated age and his apparent age, and moves on. This is a continuity error of a particular kind, one where the show has established two facts that contradict each other and declined to reconcile them. His history before Springfield is essentially unknown and inconsistently suggested. In episodes where he speaks about his past, the details don't add up to a coherent biography. He has had careers, relationships, and experiences that cannot all belong to a man who is 31 years old, or even to a man who is 81 years old. The character of Disco Stu is a background character whose name and personality are derived from a single joke in the early seasons that then calcified into a permanent aspect of the character. Disco Stu dresses in and is associated with disco music, which is an artifact of a specific cultural moment in the 1970s. As the floating timeline has moved the show's present forward through the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s and beyond, Disco Stu's attachment to a now distant cultural era has become increasingly anachronistic in ways the show acknowledges for jokes, but doesn't resolve as a continuity matter. A person who was a young adult during the disco era, which ended in the early 1980s, would by the time the show reached the 20-teens be well into their 50s or 60s. Disco Stu, like most of Springfield's adult population, hasn't aged to match the advancing calendar. Sideshow, Bob's brother Cecil Terwilliger appeared in Season 8 in an episode that is widely regarded as one of the show's best. Cecil is established in that episode as having harbored a long grudge against Bob for stealing his position as Krusty's sidekick. Cecil is sent to prison at the end of the episode. He has since appeared in subsequent episodes in contexts that require someone to have been tracking his legal status between appearances, which the show does only loosely. His imprisonment, his relationship with his brother, and his continued existence in Springfield's orbit are handled with the show's characteristic episodic flexibility, meaning Cecil is there when the story needs him and absent when it doesn't, and his situation between appearances is whatever is most convenient for the episode in which he reappears. Kearney, the oldest and most mysterious of Bart's school bullies, is a character whose background continuity is a small comedy unto itself. Kearney is established as being old enough to have a son. He is also a student at Springfield Elementary. He appears to be in his late 20s or 30s. He is simultaneously a 10-year-old's schoolyard bully and a man old enough to have fathered a child and to have had life experiences that no elementary school student could plausibly have accumulated. The show jokes about Kearney's inexplicable age occasionally, but his situation is technically a standing continuity error that has never been resolved. His specific backstory, including the mother of his child, his living situation, and the history of how he ended up as a perpetual elementary school student despite being old enough to rent a car, is inconsistent across the episodes that touch on it. Different writers have filled in different details. None of those details form a coherent biography. Groundskeeper Willie's Scottish backstory has been filled in across multiple episodes with details that don't add up to a consistent history. The specific part of Scotland he's from has been referenced differently. The circumstances of his immigration to Springfield and his arrival at the school have been suggested in different ways in different episodes. His relationship with his family back in Scotland, his military service, his prior careers, all of these elements have been mentioned in passing in episodes where they serve a joke, without being tracked carefully enough to form a continuous record. In one episode, Willie's tragic backstory is revealed in detail, providing an emotionally resonant account of loss and displacement that explains his personality and his presence at Springfield Elementary. In subsequent episodes, elements of this backstory are either ignored or subtly changed, because the writers of those subsequent episodes were using Willie for different purposes, and the specifics of his tragedy were less important than his current comedic function. The recurring characters who work at the nuclear power plant, particularly Lenny and Carl, have friendship origins that have been told differently across the series. Their history together predates the show, but the specific context of how they became friends, where they grew up, and the texture of their lives outside the plant is filled in differently in different episodes. In some seasons, they're presented as having been close since childhood. In other seasons, their friendship seems to be primarily a workplace relationship. The show has occasionally made their relationship the subject of an episode, exploring its dynamics with genuine care, while in other episodes treating them as interchangeable background figures whose only function is to be in the background of a nuclear plant scene. Carl Carlson's background is the subject of additional complexity related to his race and cultural background, which the show has explored in later seasons with Hawaiian and Caribbean backstories that were added long after the character was established. These backstories are treated as revelations within the episodes that introduce them, but they sit in uncomfortable relationship with the earlier characterization of Carl as a character whose cultural background wasn't addressed at all. The show is adding to Carl's history rather than contradicting it, but the additions feel more like expansions for the purpose of episode plots than organic developments of a character whose history was always present but unexplored. Mayor Quimby's family, his wife and children, appears with varying composition across the series. The number of his children, the ages of those children, and the specific nature of his political dynasty all shift depending on what episode needs from him. His wife, a long-suffering figure in the background of his political career, has been depicted with varying degrees of awareness about his many infidelities across the series, sometimes seeming to know and accept his behavior, sometimes seeming genuinely oblivious. Dr. Julius Hibbert, the Simpson family's physician, has a backstory that the show has touched on intermittently, including his time at a fictional medical school and his connections to other Springfield characters through that educational history. These connections, when they appear, are not always consistent with each other or with other established facts about when and where characters were educated. The Lovejoy family, Reverend Lovejoy and his wife Helen, are another set of characters whose backstories have been partially filled in across various episodes, with results that don't always align. Helen Lovejoy, whose signature contribution to Springfield's civic discourse is the phrase, "Won't someone please think of the children?" has had her reasons for this particular fixation suggested in different ways by different episodes. Her relationship with her husband and the history of his spiritual calling are touched on in episodes that use them for comedy without maintaining careful consistency. The background characters of Springfield are, collectively, a portrait of a town assembled piecemeal across 3.5 decades. Each of them was created, named, and characterized for a specific purpose in a specific episode, and each of them then became available for use in subsequent episodes, carrying their established characteristics, but not always carrying the specific details of their established histories. The result is a population of people who are visually consistent and tonally consistent but biographically inconsistent, a town full of familiar faces with unreliable pasts. Number. Section 5. Homer's job, the nuclear plant that doesn't know what it looks like. 742. That is the number of documented errors, mistakes, accidents, and safety violations attributed to Homer Simpson in his role as a nuclear safety inspector at the Springfield nuclear power plant. 742. The show presents this number in an episode where it becomes relevant to a plot about Homer's job security, and it delivers the number with the comedic casualness that is the show's default register for information that should be alarming. 742 errors. In any real industrial context, this would represent a career's worth of documentation, probably the career of someone who had been escorted from the building many years before reaching number 42, let alone number 742. The number is funny precisely because it's absurd, but it's also funny because it's a number the show is willing to state on screen, which means the show is willing to commit to this specific piece of Homer's professional history. And then, in subsequent episodes, the show commits to other specific pieces of Homer's professional history that don't always agree with each other or with the number 742. The Springfield nuclear power plant is Homer's workplace, the setting for a significant fraction of the show's storylines, and one of the most recognizable fictional workplaces in American television history. It is also a workplace that has been depicted with such creative flexibility across the show's run that its internal geography, its organizational structure, its safety record, its relationship with its own employees, and its basic physical characteristics have all changed enough times to make it feel less like a real building and more like a narrative convenience that happens to have a nuclear theme. Sector 7G, where Homer works, is established early in the series as a specific location within the plant. It has a control console, it has Homer's workstation, it has the chair where Homer sleeps, it has the donut box that is never quite empty. These are the essential furnishings of Homer's professional life, and they appear consistently enough across the series to feel real. The problem is that Sector 7G's position within the larger plant, its relationship to other departments and sections, its proximity to the reactor core, and its physical dimensions all shift depending on what the episode needs. In some episodes, Homer's workstation is clearly visible from the main corridor of the plant. In others, it's in a back area that requires navigation through several secure doors to reach. In some episodes, the control room that Homer inhabits is a large, multi-person facility with multiple workstations. In others, it's a small room where Homer appears to work essentially alone. The number of people who work in Homer's immediate vicinity changes constantly. The reactor core itself, which is the plant's most dangerous and consequential feature, is depicted with varying proximity to Homer's workplace. In some episodes, Homer's position at his console has him essentially adjacent to the core, close enough that his negligence poses immediate physical danger. In other episodes, the core is presented as a more distant feature of the plant, separated from Homer's workspace by considerable distance and multiple layers of safety, infrastructure, which is a phrase that sounds slightly absurd in the context of a plant with 342 safety violations, but nevertheless describes what the show depicts in certain episodes. The plant's cooling towers, its most recognizable external feature, are visible in establishing shots throughout the series. But their relationship to the plant's entrance and to Homer's entry point into the building each morning shifts across episodes in ways that are inconsistent with a fixed building. The walk from the parking lot to the main entrance appears to be different lengths in different episodes. The main entrance itself appears to be in different locations on the building's exterior depending on the camera angle chosen and the episode in question. Burns's office, which is at the top of the plant's main building and is depicted across hundreds of episodes as the seat of his power and the location of most of his interactions with Homer, has had its layout, its window arrangement, its furniture configuration, and its relative position on the building's floor plan change enough times across the series to make it feel like Burns has redecorated extensively and often. The famous moment where Burns uses a trapdoor beneath the seat in front of his desk to dispose of inconvenient visitors is a recurring joke, and the trapdoor exists consistently, but the room in which it exists is not the same room across different seasons. The plant's cafeteria appears in several episodes. Its size, its layout, and its menu change across those appearances. In some episodes, the cafeteria is large enough to accommodate most of the plant's workforce simultaneously. In others, it's a small, grim space. The food available in the cafeteria is inconsistent in quality across appearances, though consistently unappealing. Homer's salary is a source of continuity frustration that the show has handled with creative abandon across its run. A specific salary figure is stated in several different episodes, and the figures don't agree. In one early episode, the figure given is relatively modest, consistent with a working-class nuclear plant employee in the early 1990s. In other episodes, the figure is different, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, and the relationship between Homer's stated salary and his family's apparent standard of living is not always mathematically convincing. The Simpson family owns a house, 2 cars at various points, various pets, and participates in a lifestyle that would require a specific level of household income to sustain. The income that Homer's job should provide, based on the salary figures the show has given, is sometimes comfortably sufficient for this lifestyle, sometimes uncomfortably insufficient for it, and occasionally wildly inadequate for it. The show treats the Simpson family's economic situation as contextually determined, meaning they are comfortable or struggling based on what the episode requires, and the specific numbers are not maintained as facts that must constrain subsequent episodes. Burns's relationship with Homer, and specifically his inability to remember Homer's name, despite Homer having worked for him for the entirety of his adult life, is one of the show's most beloved running gags. Burns calls Homer various incorrect names across the series. The joke works because it's consistent in its premise. Burns doesn't know who Homer is despite their lengthy professional relationship, while being variable in its specific execution. But the continuity of this gag creates its own problems. There are episodes where Burns clearly does know who Homer is. There are moments, particularly in episodes where Homer and Burns are drawn into closer contact by the plot, where Burns addresses Homer correctly or demonstrates an awareness of Homer's specific identity that is inconsistent with the gag's premise. The show treats these moments as they occur without worrying about whether they undermine the running joke, because the running joke is the joke, not a rule that must be maintained with absolute consistency. The question of how Homer got his job at the plant in the first place has been answered in multiple incompatible ways. The most emotionally resonant version, involving the deal between Grandpa Abe and Burns, was established in a later season episode and sits in complicated relationship with earlier episodes that suggested Homer's employment at the plant was arrived at through more conventional means. The later backstory is richer and darker than the earlier implied one, but the two don't coexist easily. Homer has, over the course of the series, held literally hundreds of other jobs. The show has done episodes where Homer's restlessness, or Burns's capriciousness, or some plot complication results in Homer departing from the plant and pursuing a different career. He becomes a food critic, he becomes a boxer, he becomes a farmer, he becomes an astronaut, he becomes a grease trader, he becomes a monorail conductor, he becomes a chef, he becomes a substitute teacher. Each of these careers is pursued with characteristic Homer energy for the duration of its episode, and each of them ends with Homer returning to the plant. The inconsistency is not in the departures and returns, which are a known structural feature of the show's episodic nature. The inconsistency is in the residue these careers leave behind. When Homer becomes famous as a food critic, the town knows him as that food critic. When Homer completes astronaut training and goes to space, this is a thing that happened in Springfield's reality. When Homer wins a boxing match against a professional fighter, this is recorded somewhere in Springfield's history. And then the next episode begins and Homer is back at the plant, and the career of the previous episode is not referenced. Not because Homer changed jobs so fast that the town forgot, but because the show's episodic structure treats each career as a closed story. This is the reset button, the feature of episodic television that allows a show to tell wildly different stories without being constrained by its own history. But it creates a version of Homer whose resume, if it could be assembled from all the episodes he appears in, is one of the most extraordinary documents in American television. A single individual who has been an astronaut and a boxing champion, and a food critic and a monorail conductor, and a farmer and a chef and a grease trader, all while maintaining continuous employment at a nuclear power plant. Burns's knowledge of what goes on in the plant is similarly variable. In some episodes, he is the detail-oriented tyrant, aware of every minor event in his domain, using surveillance and informants to maintain comprehensive knowledge of his workforce. In other episodes, he is completely oblivious to things happening in the plant that would be obvious to any engaged employer. His awareness is calibrated to what the episode needs it to be, and the result is a character whose managerial style is inconsistent in a way that tracks his comedic function rather than a coherent personality. Smithers' role in the plant's operations is also handled with episodic flexibility. In some episodes, Smithers functions as a genuine second-in-command, making real operational decisions and managing actual staff. In others, he functions purely as Burns's personal assistant, with no apparent connection to the plant's operational reality. His authority over other plant employees changes depending on the episode, and his knowledge of the plant's technical operations ranges from comprehensive to essentially ornamental. The workers' union at the nuclear plant has appeared in several episodes as a background institution that either does or does not have power over the workers' conditions, depending on what the plot needs. In some episodes, the union is a real force. In others, it appears to have no meaningful presence. Homer's relationship with the union, including any dues he may or may not pay and any protections he may or may not receive from it, is treated with the same narrative flexibility as everything else about his employment. The plant's relationship with regulatory agencies, and specifically the NRC-like federal body that in the show's early seasons sent an inspector named Frank Grimes to evaluate the facility, is another source of inconsistency. The inspection that revealed 342 violations was dramatic enough to be a plot point in an episode. The consequences of that inspection, the regulatory follow-up, the ongoing relationship between the plant and whoever is supposed to be overseeing it, are not tracked consistently across subsequent episodes. The plant continues to operate. Homer continues to work there. The violations continue to exist. And the regulatory framework that should be responding to all of this is present when needed for plot purposes and absent when it isn't. Number. Section 6. Springfield's Impossible Geography, the town that lives everywhere. Pull up a map of the United States. You will not find Springfield on it. This is not because Springfield is fictional, although it is. It's because the Springfield depicted in The Simpsons does not exist in any one geographical location. It exists in all of them, simultaneously, and none of them, which is either a sophisticated artistic choice about the universality of the American experience, or a 36-year accumulation of writers not having a fixed location in mind when they wrote their episodes. It is, most likely, both. The geographical impossibility of Springfield has been documented in loving detail by fans who have assembled every geographical clue ever offered by the show and discovered that the resulting map is not a map at all. It is a list of contradictions. Springfield has been placed, through various clues, in the Pacific Northwest, in the Midwest, in the South, in New England, on the West Coast, and in proximity to the Canadian border. It has borders with Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, which is geometrically impossible. It has an ocean coastline. It also has a desert. It also has a mountain range. These geographical features coexist in a single town and its surrounding area, which would require Springfield to be approximately the size of California, which the show does not depict. But the geographical impossibility is not really the subject of this section. The subject of this section is the internal geographical inconsistency of Springfield, the errors within the show's depiction of the town itself, the ways in which the streets, the buildings, the distances between locations, and the fundamental layout of the community change between episodes. The relationship between the Simpson home on Evergreen Terrace and the other major locations in Springfield is the most basic test case, and it fails fairly quickly. In some episodes, the quick E-Mart is walking distance from the Simpson home. Homer walks there, Bart walks there. The distance is casual, something that can be covered in a few minutes without it being a notable journey. In other episodes, the quick E-Mart requires driving. It's not across town, exactly, but it's not walking distance either. The journey from the Simpson home to the quick E-Mart in these episodes involves a car, a road, and a travel time that suggests the locations are separated by enough distance to make walking a meaningful inconvenience. These two versions of the distance between the same two locations coexist across the show's run with complete equanimity. The show doesn't acknowledge the inconsistency. It simply places the quick E-Mart wherever it needs to be for the episode currently being told. Moe's Tavern, Homer's primary social venue, has a relationship with the Simpson home that is similarly elastic. The bar is close enough to the house that Homer can be summoned there quickly in some episodes, and far enough that driving is the obvious choice in others. The distance between Homer's front door and Moe's front door has, across the series, ranged from what appears to be about a 3-minute walk to what appears to be a substantial cross-town journey requiring a car and navigating through Springfield's undefined road network. Springfield Elementary School's distance from the Simpson home is equally flexible. In many episodes, the children walk to school, which implies the school is within comfortable walking distance of their home. In other episodes, they ride a school bus, which implies a distance that makes walking less practical. In a handful of episodes, the trip to school is treated as a matter of some complexity, suggesting the school is on the other side of town from the house. All three of these implied distances are present in the show's run, and none of them is wrong from the perspective of any individual episode. They are only wrong when compared to each other. The nuclear plant's relationship to the rest of Springfield is another variable. In establishing shots taken from elevated positions, the plant's cooling towers are visible on Springfield's skyline from most parts of the town, which places it relatively central. But in episodes where Homer drives to work, the driving time and the roads he takes suggest the plant is on the outskirts of town, away from the central commercial and residential areas. The plant is both visible from downtown and far enough away to require a meaningful drive, which is only possible if Springfield's central area is extremely dense or if the plant's cooling towers are extremely tall. The position of major Springfield landmarks relative to each other changes across the series in ways that make a coherent town map impossible. The church and the town hall have been depicted in a close, adjacent relationship in some episodes and in a more distant relationship in others. The baseball stadium, Duff Gardens, the monorail station, the zoo, the hospital, the courthouse, the library, and the dozens of other distinctive Springfield locations have spatial relationships with each other that shift enough across the series to produce a town whose layout is more like a list of locations than a coherent map. The monorail, introduced in the classic episode Marge vs. the Monorail, is supposed to connect the major stops in Springfield. The episode is funny and beloved, and its specific geography of the monorail's route is part of the comedy. But the monorail's existence in subsequent episodes, and the question of whether it is still operational and where it goes, is handled inconsistently. The monorail crashes at the end of its debut episode, but appears in background shots in subsequent episodes in apparent operation. Its route, as visible in background establishing shots, doesn't consistently correspond to the route established in its debut episode. The Springfield Gorge, into which Homer falls memorably in the episode Bart the Daredevil, is a geographical feature that appears several times across the series in slightly different positions relative to other landmarks. The gorge is close enough to a hospital for Homer to be taken there quickly after his fall in the debut episode, but its relationship to other Springfield landmarks varies across subsequent references to it. The cemetery, which is a recurring location in Springfield, is depicted as being in different parts of town in different episodes. This is perhaps the most practically significant geographical inconsistency because cemeteries in real towns don't move. Their location is fixed and well known. Springfield Cemetery has been depicted on the south side of town, the east side of town, and somewhere in between, depending on the establishing shots and travel routes shown in the episodes in which it appears. The ocean, when Springfield needs an ocean for a plot, is present. The mountains, when Springfield needs mountains, are present. The desert, when Springfield needs a desert, is present. Each of these geographical features appears in episodes where the story requires proximity to that type of terrain, and their distance from the center of town varies accordingly. Springfield is not a real place with consistent geography. It is a story setting that can be whatever the story needs it to be, and the geography bends to accommodate. This is perhaps most visible in the show's many episodes where characters take road trips or travel to locations described as being a certain distance from Springfield. The driving time from Springfield to other cities and states is wildly inconsistent across these episodes. In some episodes, a neighboring city is a short drive away. In others, the same city or a similar distance is treated as a long journey requiring significant preparation. The relative position of Springfield to major American cities shifts depending on which state the show's geography is currently implying Springfield belongs to, which, as established, changes constantly. The Springfield River, which flows through or near town and serves as the primary dumping ground for the nuclear plant's runoff, appears in different relationships to the town's other geographical features across episodes. It is sometimes adjacent to downtown Springfield, near enough to be relevant to central plot points. In other episodes, it is more peripheral, on the outskirts of the town's defined area. The river that connects to the ocean, when the ocean exists, does so through routes that are only possible if the river is extremely long or the town's geography has reorganized itself. None of this makes watching the show a confusing experience. The show is not asking its audience to navigate Springfield using a reliable internal map. It is asking its audience to follow characters through stories set in a recognizable community, and Springfield is recognizable enough from its recurring elements, its specific characters, its consistent tone and visual style, to function perfectly well as a setting, despite being geographically incoherent. But if you're trying to draw the map, and many fans have tried, you will end up with something that looks less like a town and more like a fever dream about a town, which is, depending on your theory about what Springfield actually is, either an error or exactly the point. Number. Section 7. The Relationship Retcons. When Springfield forgot who knew whom? A retcon, for those unfamiliar with the term, is a retroactive continuity adjustment. It is a change to established facts in a story, made after those facts were originally established, for the purpose of enabling a new story. Some retcons are transparent and acknowledged. Others are subtle, introduced without fanfare into a scene where the earlier established fact is simply ignored or quietly revised. The Simpsons has produced retcons in both categories. And the relationship retcons, the changes to who knew whom and when and under what circumstances, are among the most interesting, because they affect the emotional foundation of the show's character dynamics. The first meeting of Homer and Marge is a story the show has told, with variations, at least 4 distinct times. This is not a retcon exactly, because the show has generally framed each telling as a new flashback, revealing a different aspect of a history that the audience already knows broadly. But the specific details of each telling are inconsistent enough that the aggregate picture of their first meeting is a palimpsest, a document that has been written over itself so many times that the original writing is obscured. In The Way We Was, their first meeting occurs in high school detention. They bond over a shared moment. Homer pursues Marge with earnest, occasionally clumsy dedication. This is the foundational version of their origin story, and it's the one that established the emotional template. In I Married Marge, the story picks up after they're already in a relationship, covering their engagement and the early years of their marriage in the context of Marge's pregnancy with Bart. This episode is compatible with The Way We Was, in broad terms, but fills in specific details that create some inconsistencies with the earlier telling. In later seasons, additional flashback episodes show new aspects of Homer and Marge's history. Their first date is shown with details that aren't fully consistent with what The Way We Was established. The specific sequence of their early courtship is filled in differently. The cultural backdrop against which they fell in love changes, as discussed in the timeline section, but also the specific events of their early relationship are told with variations that make the combined history something you have to approach with interpretive flexibility rather than literal accuracy. The Barney Gumble backstory retcon is one of the show's most dramatic examples of the form. Barney Gumble is introduced in the early seasons as Homer's oldest friend. They went to high school together. Barney is drunk, often dramatically, in essentially every scene he appears in. His drinking is a fundamental character trait, presumably one of long standing. Then, in the episode Homer vs. Patty and Selma, a flashback shows the young Homer and Barney as high school students. And Barney in this flashback is not drinking. He is clean-cut, ambitious, and apparently sober. In fact, the flashback suggests that it was Homer who introduced Barney to beer during a specific conversation before a college entrance exam. Homer's casual offer of a beer in this moment derailed Barney's trajectory entirely. The implication is that Homer is personally responsible for Barney's alcoholism. This is a significant piece of backstory that reframes Barney's character considerably. It's also a piece of backstory that sits in complicated relationship with the established sense that Barney has been a drunk since before the show's timeline, since before his introduction as a character. The flashback gives his alcoholism a specific origin point and places Homer at the center of it, which has emotional resonance, but which requires the audience to accept a revision of an implied history. In subsequent episodes, Barney's history is occasionally referenced in ways that assume the flashback's version is canonical. But it's also referenced in ways that treat Barney's alcoholism as a general chronic condition without a specific origin, which is how it functioned before the flashback was introduced. The two versions of Barney's drinking history coexist without the show choosing definitively between them. Lenny and Carl's friendship origin has been touched on enough times, with enough inconsistent details, to make their shared history one of Springfield's more mysterious, unofficial backstories. They are presented consistently as very close friends. In some seasons, the show hints at their relationship with a warmth and depth that goes beyond casual workplace friendship, but the specific history of how they became close has been suggested differently in different episodes. In some episodes, they appear to have been friends since childhood, possibly since elementary school. In others, their friendship seems to be rooted primarily in their shared workplace experience at the plant. In yet others, there are suggestions of a shared history that predates both the plant and Springfield itself. These aren't large contradictions, and they don't affect the show's emotional presentation of Lenny and Carl's bond, which is one of the more quietly consistent elements of the series. But the specific facts of that bond's origin are inconsistent. Homer and Ned's history as neighbors is another relationship whose origins are handled differently across episodes. In the show's early seasons, the impression given is that Homer and Ned have been neighbors for Homer's entire adult life at the Evergreen Terrace house, and that their dynamic, Homer's resentment of Ned's relentless goodness combined with occasional genuine warmth, has been present since Homer and Marge first moved in. This is the relationship's default characterization, but flashback episodes that show Homer and Marge's early marriage, including the years when their children were very young, don't always include Ned as an established presence in their lives. The specific point at which Ned moved in next door, or the specific point at which Homer moved in next door to Ned, is not clearly fixed. The relationship's history is occasionally treated as long and deep, and occasionally treated as more recent, depending on what the episode needs. The history between Sideshow Bob and Bart is a relationship that the show has developed across many episodes, with generally strong continuity, but specific details have been revised. The initial encounter, where Bart exposed Sideshow Bob's criminal conspiracy against Krusty, is the foundational moment, and it's consistently referenced as such. But the specific nature of Sideshow Bob's vendetta against Bart, and the particular quality of his obsession, has been characterized differently by different writers working on different Sideshow Bob episodes. Some writers have written Bob as a genuinely theatrical, almost admiring antagonist, one who respects Bart's intelligence even while trying to kill him. Others have written him as more purely malevolent, his hatred for Bart simpler and less textured. These are characterization choices rather than strict continuity errors, but they produce a version of Sideshow Bob whose motivation and emotional relationship with his nemesis varies enough to sometimes feel like a different character wearing the same outfit. The Simpsons family's history with Grandpa Abe has been handled with the show's characteristic episodic approach, meaning the specific nature of Homer and Abe's relationship is developed across episodes that each add new texture, without always maintaining consistency with what came before. The episode Mother Simpson adds enormous depth to the family's history by revealing what happened to Homer's mother and the role Burns played in her disappearance. This is a late series revelation that retroactively changes the meaning of Homer's relationship with Grandpa, of Homer's relationship with Burns, and of Homer's entire psychological backstory. It's a retcon in the sense that it introduces new facts about a history that was previously presented without these facts. The episode handles this beautifully. It doesn't contradict what came before so much as it adds a layer of darkness beneath what came before. But subsequent episodes don't always maintain the implications of this added darkness. Homer's relationship with Burns after Mother Simpson should carry the weight of what Homer now knows. In some episodes it does. In others, Homer treats Burns with the same combination of fear and resignation that characterize their pre-revelation dynamic, as though Homer has absorbed the knowledge but chosen not to let it change anything, which is in some ways the most psychologically accurate characterization of Homer possible, but which is also partly attributable to the show's reset tendency. The question of what Homer knows about his family's history at any given moment is itself a continuity question. The show has revealed various pieces of Homer's past across its run, each revelation changing the landscape of his understanding. But his behavior in subsequent episodes doesn't always reflect a Homer who has internalized those revelations. The knowledge accumulates in the show's archive while Homer remains roughly the same Homer, which is a feature of the show's structure but also a source of ongoing continuity inconsistency. Number. Section 8. The production errors nobody caught. Springfield's technical mistakes. This section is about the smallest category of error, the ones that have nothing to do with story or continuity or character history. These are the purely technical errors, the ones that happened in production and slipped through quality control and ended up on television, where they have been sitting quietly in episodes that air in syndication dozens of times per year. These are the errors that reward pause. The most basic category is the sound error. The Simpsons is a heavily produced audio experience. The voice performances are one of the show's signature strengths, and the supporting sound design, including the background sound of Springfield, the specific sounds of the nuclear plant, the sound of Moe's bar, the sound of the school, all of this audio work is careful and deliberate, which makes the occasional sound error more noticeable. There are episodes where dialogue appears to be slightly out of sync with the character's mouth movement. This lip sync error, discussed in the earlier section on animation errors, is the most common production error in the audio domain, but there are others. In some scenes, background sound that should be present in the established setting is missing. A bar scene without the background murmur of a bar, a school hallway without the ambient sound of students moving through a school, a moment where the audio environment doesn't match the visual environment. In other scenes, the reverse is true. Background sound from a previous scene, or from the scene the show is about to cut to, bleeds in slightly early, creating a brief moment where two locations' audio environments are layered on top of each other in a way that shouldn't be possible given where the characters are. There are also instances where sound effects are applied to the wrong action. A door closing sounds like a car door instead of a house door. A footstep sounds like it's on gravel rather than on the linoleum floor that's depicted. These are small errors, the kind that happen when the Foley work or the sound design is rushed, or when the final mix doesn't catch a replacement effect that was applied to the wrong cue. The most charming category of production error, from a human interest standpoint, is the character who speaks a line that belongs to a different character. This happens in animated shows because the voice recording is done before the animation, and sometimes the editorial process of matching animation to voice creates situations where the animation of one character's mouth is synchronized with a line that was written for and recorded by a different character. In the finished episode, the mouth of one character moves while the voice of another character's actor delivers the line. This is rare in The Simpsons because the voice cast is carefully matched to characters and the production is attentive. But it has happened. There are moments in the series where an attentive viewer can observe a slight mismatch between whose mouth is moving and whose voice is speaking. These moments are brief, sometimes just a word or a short phrase, and they require careful attention to notice. But they're there. Color errors in major character appearances are slightly more common than you might expect. The show's color design is precise and intentional. Homer's skin is that specific shade of yellow. His shirt is white. His pants are blue. These colors define the character as much as his shape does. And yet across the series there are frames, sometimes extending to full scenes, where Homer's shirt is slightly off-white, or his pants are a different shade of blue, or the flesh tone on his hands and arms is a slightly different yellow than the flesh tone on his face. These color inconsistencies are most visible in scenes that involve complex lighting effects, like firelight or the glow of a television screen, or the specific indoor lighting of the nuclear plant's control room. The light adjustment process that makes the scene's background and environmental colors look right occasionally shifts the character's core colors slightly off their canonical values. In the early years of digital production, this was a more significant issue than it later became, as the tools for maintaining color consistency across complex lighting environments improved. Background text is another rich source of production errors. The Simpsons is famous for loading background text, signs, labels, bulletin boards, storefronts, and similar visual details with jokes. These jokes are part of the show's layered comedy, rewards for attentive viewers who pause and read the background. But the background text also contains errors, misspelled words, incorrect phone numbers, labels that describe the wrong product, store names that change between shots of the same storefront in the same scene. Some of these are intentional jokes. The show has always had a tradition of putting funny errors into background text as deliberate gags. But some of them are genuine production errors where a text element was placed incorrectly or inconsistently, and they've remained in the episode because they're in the background, and nobody caught them in the review process. The specific framing of some scenes creates errors when shots are composed inconsistently. A character who is standing in a specific position relative to a piece of furniture in one shot appears to be in a slightly different position in the next shot without having moved between them. An object that was on the left side of a desk appears on the right side in the reverse angle shot. These are continuity errors of the blocking variety, where the physical positions of elements within a scene are not maintained consistently between the different camera angles used to film it. In live-action television, this category of error is caught by a script supervisor whose job is specifically to track these physical continuity elements between shots. In animation, the equivalent job is done by people who are tracking the positions of animated elements across multiple drawings. The Simpsons has been generally careful about this, but across 788 episodes, there are nonetheless moments where the physical relationships between characters and objects shift between shots in ways that are technically incorrect. The show's opening couch gag, one of its most celebrated recurring elements, is itself a source of occasional technical inconsistency. The couch gag changes every episode, which is the whole point, and some of the more elaborate couch gags required production choices that, when the episode is then viewed in broadcast or streaming, don't quite match the transitions into and out of the standard opening sequence. The visual quality of the couch gag in some episodes is slightly different from the rest of the episode because different animation techniques or different studios were used to produce the special couch gag, and the resulting join between the special animation and the standard animation isn't always seamless. The chalkboard gag, which precedes the couch gag in the opening sequence and shows Bart writing a different sentence on a classroom chalkboard each episode, has on a handful of occasions had font or handwriting inconsistencies where the text doesn't look like the show's established handwriting style for Bart's chalkboard. These are very small errors, and they're not the kind of thing that affects the experience of watching the show, but they're there. Sound mix errors, where the relative volume levels between dialogue, music, and sound effects are slightly off from what the final polish should produce, appear occasionally in the show's run, more often in some seasons than others, depending on the production resources available for audio post-production. There are episodes where character dialogue is slightly too quiet relative to background music, creating a scene where you have to concentrate to hear what's being said. There are other episodes where background sound effects are slightly too loud, providing an ambient environment that is distractingly present rather than supportively present. The show's musical score, which has been produced by a single composer, Alf Clausen, for most of its run, is one of its most consistently excellent elements. The score is responsive to the emotional register of each scene and maintains a distinctive sound while being flexible enough to serve comedy, drama, and the show's occasional ventures into full musical pastiche. But even the score contains occasional errors. Musical cues that end slightly abruptly because the scene cut was moved in editing without the score being adjusted to match. Musical transitions that are slightly rough because the cue that was selected for a scene was designed for a slightly different scene length. These are production issues that occur in every scored television show, and The Simpsons' musical direction is generally careful enough that these rough transitions are infrequent. But they exist. The episode Bart Gets Famous, which is the one where Bart becomes a catchphrase dispensing minor celebrity, contains a sound editing error that a small number of attentive viewers have noticed over the years. In a scene toward the end of the episode, a character delivers a line while a sound effect from a different part of the scene plays simultaneously, creating a brief audio collision that shouldn't be there. It's the kind of error that passes by in a moment and is gone, and most viewers would never notice it because the human brain is very good at tolerating small inconsistencies in audio and correcting for them. But it's there in the final broadcast, a small ghost of a production conversation that happened and wasn't quite resolved. These technical errors are the quietest category of Simpsons mistake. They don't affect the story. They don't reveal contradictions in the characters or the world. They're simply evidence that a complicated piece of machinery was assembled by human beings under time and resource constraints, and that human beings, even very skilled and dedicated ones, sometimes miss things. Number. Section 9. The guest star contradictions. When famous people forgot they'd already visited. The Simpsons has had more celebrity guest appearances than any other animated show in history, and probably more than most live-action shows too. The guest roster across 788 episodes includes musicians, actors, athletes, politicians, scientists, philosophers, and a category of cultural figures that can only be described as famous for being famous. They show up in Springfield, they meet the characters, they either play themselves or play a distinct character, and then they go. And sometimes they come back. Or someone who already appeared in one context appears in a different context. Or a celebrity who was established as known to the Simpson family somehow fails to recognize the Simpson family in a subsequent episode. The guest star continuity errors are a gentle and somewhat charming subset of the show's broader continuity challenges. The most fundamental version of this error is the guest star who plays themselves in one episode and then appears again in a later episode as if meeting these characters for the first time. The Simpsons introduces celebrity guests in episodes where their presence is the point, where the comedy or the plot depends on the fact that this real famous person has intersected with the Springfield reality. And then, in a later episode, when a story requires the presence of a celebrity, the same person returns, and the writers, working on a different season in a different year, either don't check whether this person has already appeared in the show or don't treat a previous appearance as continuity that needs to be honored. The result is occasional moments where a celebrity appears to meet Homer and Marge for the first time when they have in a canonical previous episode already met them. The second meeting proceeds with the same energy of introduction as the first, as though the first never happened. Michael Jackson's appearance in Stark Raving Dad, the Season 3 premiere, is one of the most celebrated guest appearances in the show's history. Jackson played a large white man named Leon Kompowski who believed himself to be Michael Jackson, with Jackson himself uncredited and providing the speaking voice for the character. This was a major cultural event when it aired in 1991. Subsequently, references to this episode within the show's continuity are scarce. The event of Homer having been institutionalized with a man who claimed to be Michael Jackson, and the connection that episode established with the real Michael Jackson's world, is not carried forward in a way that affects how the show subsequently treats the Jackson persona, or the idea of Homer having had this extraordinary experience. This is partly because the episode was later controversially pulled from rotation, following accusations against Jackson, but even before that decision, the specific continuity implications of the episode for Homer's subsequent engagement with celebrity culture were not maintained. Tony Bennett appeared in Dancin' Homer in Season 2, where Homer meets him at a baseball game, and they share a moment. In subsequent episodes, Homer interacts with other celebrities without any sense that he is a person who once shared a meaningful moment with Tony Bennett. The specific experience of celebrity encounter in Dancin' Homer doesn't create lasting characterization for Homer as someone who has these kinds of encounters, even as the show goes on to give him many more of them. Paul and Linda McCartney appeared in Lisa the Vegetarian in Season 7, in one of the most beloved guest appearances in the show's history. The episode ends with a reconciliation between Lisa and Homer, and Paul McCartney quietly provides Lisa with his recipe for something, and tells her that if you play a song backwards, a hidden message can be heard. This episode established that Lisa's vegetarianism is a permanent part of her character going forward, which it has been, making it one of the show's most significant continuity points around a guest appearance. But Paul McCartney's subsequent non-appearances, and the question of whether Lisa, a passionate music fan and intellectual, would have remained affected by having met a Beatle, is handled with the show's standard episodic looseness. Lisa is a Beatle fan in episodes where it's relevant. The specific experience of having met one is not maintained as a biographical fact that shapes her behavior. Several episodes have featured musicians in ways where the musician plays themselves at a specific performance or event within Springfield, and subsequent episodes treat Springfield's music scene as though these events didn't happen, or treat the same musician as unknown to the characters who met them in previous episodes. The Smashing Pumpkins appeared in Homer Palooza in Season 7, at the fictional festival Homer becomes involved with. The show is set at a specific music festival, and the characters interact with the band in Springfield. In subsequent episodes, references to music or to this specific period of Homer's life are made without consistent acknowledgement of this particular experience. Dustin Hoffman appeared uncredited in Lisa's substitute, voicing a character named Mr. Bergstrom, who is Lisa's substitute teacher and who forms a meaningful connection with her during the episode. This is one of the most emotionally affecting episodes of the series, and the Mr. Bergstrom character is one of the show's most successful one-episode characters. His exit from Lisa's life at the end of the episode is handled with real emotional care. His subsequent non-presence in Lisa's life, and the way the show occasionally revisits Lisa's loneliness, and her tendency to form intense connections with figures who then leave, is handled without direct reference to the Mr. Bergstrom experience in a way that makes narrative sense, since people don't constantly reference formative experiences by name, but which also means the specific emotional foundation laid by that episode doesn't build into Lisa's subsequent character in a tracked way. Johnny Cash voiced a coyote spirit guide who appears to Homer in a desert vision in the episode El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer. This is one of the show's most distinctive and visually ambitious episodes, and Cash's voice is used beautifully. The experience Homer has in this episode, the hallucinatory journey, the conversation with his spirit guide, the fundamental emotional question the episode raises about whether Marge is truly Homer's soulmate, are handled with the episode as a self-contained emotional statement. The question of what a man does with the memory of having spoken to a spirit guide in the form of a coyote voiced by Johnny Cash is, perhaps, not one that subsequent episode writers felt obligated to track. But the experience was treated within its episode as a genuine and significant one for Homer's self-understanding, and the subsequent episode's silence on this experience is consistent with the show's general approach to not tracking the transformative experiences that Homer accumulates. Several guest stars have appeared in the show playing characters other than themselves, which creates a different kind of continuity complication. When a recognizable voice actor or celebrity who has previously appeared as themselves appears in a different episode playing a fictional character, the audience's awareness of who is providing the voice can create a minor reality collision that the show handles by simply not addressing it. The show has also had guest stars who appeared as themselves and were depicted interacting with Springfield in ways that would be, within the logic of the show's universe, significant and memorable events. A rock band playing a concert in Springfield, a famous athlete coaching the local team, a scientist presenting at a Springfield event. These are all things that would presumably leave traces in a town's collective memory. But Springfield's collective memory, as established, is selective at best and structurally deficient at worst, so the traces are generally absent in subsequent episodes. There is a quiet comedy in the accumulation of these non-traces. If you assembled a history of Springfield from all of its canonical events, including every celebrity visit, every major catastrophe, every significant community event across 36 seasons, you would have the most eventful small town in American history. The number of famous people who have visited Springfield, the number of world historical events that have touched it, the number of crises it has survived, all of this is preposterously dense for a single community. And then you would note that the Springfield of any given episode carries essentially none of this accumulated history. It is a town that has experienced everything and remembered nothing, and whose guest visitors have a similarly complete amnesia about their previous Springfield visits. Number. Section 10. The Death and Return Problem, Springfield's Revolving Graveyard. Death in Springfield is a negotiable condition. This is true for the obvious cartoon characters like Hans Moleman, who dies as a running gag with full acknowledgement that death is for him a temporary state. But it's also true for characters who die in more narratively serious contexts, whose deaths are treated as significant events when they occur, and whose subsequent returns are handled with varying degrees of acknowledgement. The show has a complex relationship with the permanence of death. It has produced some of its most emotionally resonant moments around character deaths. It has maintained the deaths of some characters with genuine consistency, and it has quietly walked back the deaths of others, or pretended they didn't happen, or found narrative workarounds that let a character who died appear again without directly contradicting their death, because the show needed them for a story. The clearest example of a death maintained with absolute consistency is Maud Flanders, whose death in season 11 was, as noted, the result of a behind-the-scenes contractual situation rather than a storytelling choice. The show has maintained Maud's death across all subsequent seasons, which is relatively easy when the voice actor is no longer available and when the decision to kill the character was made definitively. The deaths that are not maintained consistently are the ones that happened within episodes for narrative purposes, and which the writers of subsequent episodes found it useful to ignore or to finesse. Frank Grimes, who died in the episode Homer's Enemy in Season 8, is the show's most famous example of this category. The Grimes episode is widely regarded as one of the show's finest, a genuinely dark examination of what Homer Simpson, a man who succeeds through luck and others' effort and basic human goodwill, would look like through the eyes of someone who has achieved through pure effort and receives nothing. Frank Grimes is competent, hardworking, and permanently disadvantaged. Homer is incompetent, oblivious, and permanently fortunate. Grimes's hatred of Homer escalates to madness, and his death, caused by electrocution while imitating Homer's reckless behavior, is played as a dark and genuine tragedy. Frank Grimes dies. This is established clearly. His funeral is shown, and then, in a later season episode, Frank Grimes Jr. is introduced, a son of Frank Grimes, who blames Homer for his father's death and seeks revenge. This episode, while interesting as a concept, has a complication. It requires Grimes to have had a son who was old enough by the time of the later episode to seek adult revenge, which requires Frank Grimes to have fathered this son at a specific point in his life relative to his death, which the earlier episode's characterization of Grimes makes somewhat implausible. Grimes was depicted as a man who lived alone in a single room above a bowling alley, a profoundly isolated person. The introduction of a vengeful son adds a biographical detail that requires either a revision of Grimes's backstory or a creative interpretation of the word son. The show handles this with characteristic casualness. Frank Grimes Jr. exists. He is Grimes's son. The question of exactly how is not pursued. Bleeding Gums Murphy, the jazz musician who serves as Lisa's spiritual mentor in her early seasons and whose music is her deepest creative inspiration, dies in Season 6. His death is handled with genuine emotional weight. His funeral sequence is one of the show's most moving, and Lisa's grief is authentic. The episode establishes that this mentor figure is gone. In subsequent episodes, Bleeding Gums Murphy is referenced occasionally, and his memory is treated as significant to Lisa's musical development. But the specific emotional weight of his loss, the particular quality of grief that Lisa experienced when he died, is not consistently maintained as a biographical fact shaping her ongoing character. Some episodes give Lisa's musicianship a historical depth that acknowledges she had a mentor who died, while others treat her relationship with jazz as more generically developed without specific reference to the foundational influence of this character. This is partly because Bleeding Gums Murphy's death, while emotionally significant within its episode, was not designed as a pivot point in Lisa's character development in the way that the writers of subsequent Lisa-focused episodes would need it to be if they were going to track its implications. He died in a way that served the episode that killed him, and his absence was noted, but the show moved forward. The various deaths that occur in Treehouse of Horror episodes are in a different category, since those episodes are explicitly non-canonical, but the line between canonical and non-canonical is sometimes blurry in a show that doesn't maintain tight canonical consistency anyway. Characters who are killed in elaborate ways in Treehouse of Horror episodes appear in subsequent episodes' canonical content without the deaths being acknowledged, which is the expected and appropriate approach, but which contributes to the general sense that death in Springfield is flexible. There are also deaths that are implied rather than shown, that are strong enough within their episodes to register as real and permanent, but that are subsequently contradicted when the character reappears. In a handful of cases across the show's run, supporting characters who were clearly established as dead in one episode appear alive and unremarked upon in later episodes. These are genuine continuity errors, cases where the writers of later episodes either didn't check the character's canonical status or chose to ignore it for convenience. Gil Gunderson, the show's pathologically unlucky salesman character, has died in at least one episode. He has also continued to appear in episodes after that death without acknowledgement. Gil's mortality is one of the show's many items in the Hans Moleman category, where the characters' deaths function as episodic jokes rather than narrative events, and subsequent episodes treat him as alive because the show needs him to be available for more misfortune. The Springfield Elementary School has lost several teachers and other staff across the show's run, in episodes where the loss was treated as significant, only for those positions to be quietly filled or ignored in subsequent episodes, without reference to the people who previously occupied them. The rotating roster of adult characters connected to the school has produced several instances where someone who was last seen in a situation that implied death or permanent departure appears again without explanation. The recurring character of Sideshow Bob provides the show's most explicit example of death being temporarily imposed and then negotiated around. Bob has been in situations where his death appeared imminent or even accomplished and has returned. The show is relatively explicit about Bob's returns, treating them as part of his character's essential indestructibility, the dark mirror of Homer's cartoon immortality. Bob keeps coming back because he is one of the show's most beloved antagonists, and the writers want to continue telling Sideshow Bob stories, which requires Sideshow Bob to be alive. The deaths of recurring characters in the show's run that have been maintained most consistently are the ones that were backed by practical production realities. Maude Flanders died because the voice actor left. Phil Hartman's characters, Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure, were retired, and their deaths acknowledged because Hartman's murder in 1998 made it impossible for anyone else to voice the characters without the comparison being painful and inappropriate. These practical necessities created clean, canonical deaths. The deaths that happened purely for narrative reasons, without a corresponding production reality forcing the issue, are the ones that have been maintained with varying consistency. Springfield's relationship with death is, as with everything else in Springfield, a matter of what the current episode needs it to be. Number. Section 11. The Treehouse of Horror Overflow. When Halloween ate the canon. The Simpsons' annual Treehouse of Horror specials are, by the show's own stated rules, completely separate from the canonical continuity of the series. They are horror parody anthologies, structured as 3 short stories per episode, set in a universe where the rules of Springfield don't apply and characters can be killed, transformed, or placed in wildly impossible situations without these events having any bearing on the next week's canonical episode. This is the stated position. The actual practice is messier, and the mess is interesting. The boundary between Treehouse of Horror material and canonical Springfield material has been breached in both directions. There are canonical episodes that feature elements, tones, or plot structures that feel like they belong in a Treehouse of Horror special. There are Treehouse of Horror episodes that have been mistakenly treated by the writers of subsequent canonical episodes as having actually happened. And there is an ongoing confusion, in certain corners of the fan community and occasionally within the show's own production, about which events happened in which version of Springfield. The earliest Treehouse of Horror episodes were relatively careful about maintaining the boundary. The wraparound framing device, which in the earliest specials involved the family sitting around telling scary stories, created a clear narrative container that established the events as stories within stories, not events in the main Springfield timeline. As the specials evolved, the wraparound framing became less elaborate and eventually disappeared in many installments. The special's anthology format became self-evident enough that the show stopped feeling it needed to explicitly frame the stories as fictional within the fictional world of the show. This reduced the explicit barrier between Treehouse of Horror content and canonical content. The result is that some Treehouse of Horror episodes feel like they're set in a slightly different version of Springfield, rather than an explicitly non-canonical alternate reality. The characters behave like the canonical characters. The town looks like the canonical town. The events are extreme, but no more extreme than some canonical Springfield events. The line blurs. This blurring has occasionally produced errors where a creative element that was introduced in a Treehouse of Horror episode gets referenced in a canonical episode as though it happened in canon. A character appearance, a piece of technology, a specific event involving the characters, gets picked up by a writer working on a canonical episode who may have encountered it in the show's archive without clearly noting which category of episode it came from. These crossovers from the horror universe to the canonical universe are generally caught in the production process, but not always. And even when they're caught, the fact that they happened, that the boundary was crossed briefly in the writing process, is evidence of how porous the boundary between the two Springfield realities has become. The more interesting direction of the boundary violation is when canonical episodes borrow elements that feel like they belong in the treehouse of horror tradition. Springfield has, in canonical episodes, had aliens, time travel, alternate dimensions, visits from God, encounters with the devil, ghosts, and supernatural events of various kinds. The show's approach to these canonical supernatural events is to treat them with the same tone of casual comedy that it applies to everything else, which means they don't feel dramatically different from the supernatural events in the horror specials. When God appears in canonical episodes, and God appears several times in canonical Springfield, the show handles it with the same comedic register it uses for everything. When Homer encounters figures from history, when Springfield is visited by supernatural entities, when the town experiences events that defy physical reality, the canonical framing doesn't make these events feel more real than the treehouse of horror versions of similar events. Both are equally casual about their impossibility. This tonal continuity between the canonical and the horror special registers is one of the show's distinctive qualities. Springfield is a place where the impossible is mundane, and that quality is as present in the canonical episodes as in the deliberate fantasies of the horror specials. But it also means that a viewer trying to determine which impossible things actually happened in Springfield's canonical history has a genuine challenge. The segment Treehouse of Horror V contains The Shinning, a Shining parody where Homer goes mad and nearly kills his family. This is one of the show's most celebrated horror segments. It is definitively non-canonical, and yet the image of Homer with an axe, yelling a variation on The Shining's famous line, has become part of the show's visual iconography in a way that bleeds between the horror and canonical contexts. Homer has, in canonical episodes, had moments of violence or near violence that reference or parallel his treehouse of horror behavior. The canonical Homer and the horror special Homer share enough behavioral DNA that the horror segment reads partly as an exaggeration of real character traits rather than as a completely separate character in a completely separate reality. The Kang and Kodos characters, the show's recurring alien antagonists who appear primarily in Treehouse of Horror specials but who have occasionally appeared in canonical episodes as well, represent the most explicit example of horror special characters crossing into canonical Springfield. Their canonical appearances are few and are generally treated as anomalous even within the episodes that contain them. But their presence in canonical episodes, however brief, means that the show's universe technically contains alien beings of a specific type, even though these beings are primarily associated with the non-canonical horror tradition. The specific mechanics of time travel, as depicted in Treehouse of Horror segments, where Homer or other characters travel through time, have been inconsistently applied across both horror special and canonical episodes that involve time travel. The rules of how time travel works in Springfield, to the extent that rules can be said to exist, are different in different episodes because the writers establish whatever temporal mechanics serve the story being told, without necessarily checking what previous episodes established. The horror special versions of Springfield technology, including various gadgets and devices introduced in science fiction parody segments, occasionally resurface in canonical episodes in situations where a similar device would be useful for the plot. The show doesn't explicitly flag these as the same technology from a horror special. It just uses the device concept because it's a useful concept, and the connection to the horror special version is left for attentive viewers to notice or ignore. The wraparound narrative of the earliest Treehouse of Horror specials, where the family is sitting around telling each other scary stories, creates an interesting canonical question. In the canonical Springfield, do the Simpsons do this? Is telling each other horror stories a thing that the family in canonical Springfield does together? The canonical episodes never reference this tradition. It appears only in the horror specials, which means either it's a non-canonical framing device that exists only within the specials, or it's something the canonical family does but that the canonical episodes never depict. This is a small ambiguity and probably one that doesn't matter, but it's characteristic of the show's approach to the boundary between its canonical and non-canonical material. The line exists, in principle. In practice, it's permeable in ways that are often charming and occasionally confusing. Number. Section 12. The final accumulation, when all the mistakes add up to something. Here is where we step back from the specific errors and look at the larger picture they form. 788 episodes, 36 years. Hundreds of writers, thousands of animators and production staff, multiple transitions in technology and production process, a voice cast that has aged while playing characters who haven't, and a world that has changed beyond recognition, while Springfield has remained, in its essential character, exactly what it was in December of 1989. In that context, the errors we've spent this time cataloging are not failures. They are the evidence of an enormous, sustained creative effort maintained across a longer period than most television shows exist, let alone remain culturally relevant. The animation errors are the marks of human hands. The continuity mistakes are the tracks left by hundreds of different people, each working on their piece of a larger puzzle they could only partially see. The timeline disasters are what happens when you build a world that is meant to be timeless and then ask it to coexist with real time for 3.5 decades. The Simpsons is not a perfect object. It never claimed to be. The show's original creative philosophy, which was to be funny first, consistent second, and narratively tidy a distant third, was an honest articulation of priorities that produced something remarkable and durable. The imperfections are part of what it is. But there's something else worth noting about the accumulated mistakes, which is that they have a secondary life in the show's culture. The continuity errors are the substrate on which fan theories grow. The inconsistencies in the characters' histories are the cracks through which imagination enters. The animation mistakes are the invitation to pay attention, to slow down, to notice the particular and the specific within something you've watched so many times that it's become a comfortable background presence. The Homer's coma theory is the most famous example. That theory exists, in part, because the show's post-season 4 content changed enough from its pre-season 4 content to make the change visible and worth explaining. The radiation theory exists because the show populated Springfield with enough visual inconsistencies and environmental violations to make a coherent interpretation possible. The Maggie theories exist because the show gave Maggie enough moments of apparent intelligence and then surrounded those moments with enough inconsistency about what she does and doesn't understand that the gaps become a canvas for interpretation. The mistakes make the theories possible. The inconsistencies create the space for imagination to inhabit. A perfectly consistent Springfield would be a less interesting Springfield, because it would be a Springfield with no mysteries, no ambiguities, no cracks in the surface where interpretation can enter. This is not an argument that mistakes are good, exactly. It's an observation that in a creative work of this scale and duration, the mistakes become part of the work. They accumulate alongside the intentional choices. They become visible to attentive eyes and invisible to casual ones. And the practice of finding them, of watching carefully and noticing what doesn't quite match, is its own kind of pleasure. Separate from the pleasure of watching the show for its characters and comedy, there is a specific category of error that is particularly interesting from this perspective, which is the error that the show subsequently acknowledged or leaned into. The show has on several occasions noticed that a mistake or inconsistency had become visible to the audience and responded by making a joke about it, or by writing it explicitly into a subsequent episode as though the inconsistency was always a feature. This is a form of retrospective intentionality, where an accidental element of the show becomes, through acknowledgement, an intentional one. The mistake is adopted. It's absorbed into the show's self-understanding, and once it's adopted, it stops being a mistake in any meaningful sense and becomes instead a characteristic. The most obvious example is the show's own acknowledgement of its reset structure, its tendency to return everything to normal at the end of each episode regardless of what has happened. The show has joked about this directly in episodes that deliberately call attention to the reset, that make the reset a meta-joke about the nature of serial episodic television. The reset stopped being a limitation of the show's structure and became a recurring self-aware gag about that limitation. The floating timeline has been addressed similarly. The show knows nobody ages. The show has made jokes about nobody aging. The fact that Bart is still 10 years old after 36 years is something the show finds funny and says so, which transforms it from an awkward production reality into a deliberate comedic commitment. The geographical impossibility of Springfield was, as noted earlier, confirmed by Matt Groening as intentional after decades of being an apparent inconsistency. The errors that made Springfield's location ambiguous were retroactively framed as a choice rather than an oversight. Not all errors get this treatment. Most of them just sit there, quiet and specific, in episodes that air in syndication. a character in the wrong location, a wedding that happened at a different time depending on which episode you watch, a building that moved, a past that got rewritten, a death that was undone without comment. These smaller errors don't get acknowledged. They don't get absorbed into the show's self-aware mythology. They remain what they are. The evidence that human beings made this under real conditions for a long time and that human beings make mistakes. There is something genuinely peaceful about this, late at night. Watching Springfield in the specific quality of attention that comes with diminished alertness and the warm familiarity of a show you've known for most of your life. The mistakes are not distressing. They're not failures that need to be corrected. They're the human scale of the thing, the reminder that the vast and comfortable world of Springfield, with all its impossible geography and contradictory history and characters who can't quite keep their own stories straight, was made by people sitting at drawing boards and writing tables and audio recording studios, doing their best work under the conditions available to them. The animation errors in particular have this quality. When you find a background character who shouldn't be there, or a prop that changed color between shots, or a room whose dimensions shifted between episodes, you are finding the mark of a hand. You're seeing the place where a drawing was made slightly differently from the drawing before it, where a choice was made quickly or carelessly or simply not made at all, where the machinery of production moved faster than the quality control could keep up. And the show is still beautiful. The mistakes don't diminish it. Springfield is still one of the most recognizable fictional places in American culture. Homer is still one of the most recognizable fictional characters in the world. The show has produced more memorable moments, more beloved episodes, more culturally resonant characters than almost any other piece of American popular entertainment. The mistakes are just there in the background of all of that, like the cracked cooling towers of the nuclear plant, like the slightly wrong position of a building, like the stubble that appears and disappears on Homer's face between close-ups. They're part of the texture of the thing. And there is one last category of mistake that is perhaps the most interesting of all, which is the mistakes that turned into something else. The continuity error that inspired a fan theory. The animation inconsistency that a devoted fan noticed and built an elaborate explanation for. The timeline contradiction that prompted years of debate and ultimately produced a more interesting version of Springfield's history than a perfectly consistent timeline would have. The show's mistakes have a generative quality. They produce thinking, they produce attention, they produce the kind of slow, careful engagement with a work that most entertainment discourages, and that Springfield, with all its accumulated inconsistencies, quietly invites. You can watch The Simpsons for the jokes, and you should, because the jokes are often extraordinary. You can watch it for the characters, for the emotional resonance of a family whose love for each other persists across every disaster and every reset. You can watch it for the cultural commentary, for the satire of American life that has been so consistently sharp for so long that it's become a lens through which a generation processes its reality. Or you can watch it for the mistakes, for the background character who shouldn't be there, for the room that's the wrong size, for the past that got quietly rewritten, for the death that happened and then didn't, for all the small and large ways in which a colossal creative machine, running for 36 years, left its fingerprints on the work. The nuclear plant leaks, the timeline drifts, the geography contradicts itself, the characters forget their own histories, and every Sunday night, more or less, the family sits down on the couch and the couch gag plays and the episode begins, and Springfield is Springfield, exactly as it was, exactly as it isn't, exactly as it never quite was and never quite won't be. That's the show, all 788 episodes of it, mistakes and all. And that's what we've been doing here tonight, or this morning, or whatever hour this is wherever you're watching from. Sitting in the particular quiet of someone who has chosen to spend time in Springfield, not because Springfield is perfect, but because it's familiar and strange in exactly the right combination, because it's full of things to notice, because there is always something you haven't seen before in an episode you've watched 20 times, because the mistakes are there, patient and endless, like a very gentle invitation to pay closer attention to something you love. So keep watching, keep noticing. Keep pausing on the frame that doesn't quite look right, the name that doesn't match what the show said last season, the building that moved, the character who was supposed to be somewhere else. Springfield is full of errors. Springfield is full of wonder. And if you look closely enough at the right angle in the right light, late enough at night, they're the same thing. Number. Extended notes. The smaller errors we haven't gotten to yet? A gentle final collection. There are always more. That's the nature of 36 seasons. You think you've covered the landscape, and then you realize you've been looking at the mountains while the valleys were full of things you haven't visited yet. So here, in no particular order, with no particular urgency, is a further collection of Simpsons errors, inconsistencies, and gentle production failures, offered in the spirit of a long exhale at the end of an enjoyable survey. The Flanders backyard fence is a recurring background element in scenes set between the Simpson and Flanders properties, and its height, construction, and precise location relative to the houses on either side changes across the seasons with a consistency that makes it feel like the fence itself is experiencing the show's general indifference to physical continuity. In some episodes, the fence is a standard height, easily leaned over for conversation between neighbors. In others, it's taller, more of a visual barrier. The fence's gate, which appears in some episodes, is absent in others. The gate's direction of opening when it does appear is not consistent. The Simpsons telephone has changed models across the show's run in ways that generally reflect real-world telephone technology advancing from the early 90s to the present. This is a reasonable and mostly consistent set of upgrades. The inconsistency appears in flashback sequences, where the phone visible in a scene set in a specific year of the past doesn't always match the phone that would have been current in that year, because the flashback was animated using a prop from the show's current visual library rather than researching the correct period prop. The chalkboard in Bart's classroom at Springfield Elementary changes its text between episodes, which is the expected behavior for a chalkboard used by a teacher for actual lessons. But the specific text on the chalkboard in background shots of the classroom doesn't always reflect what the current lesson is supposed to be about. In episodes where the class is explicitly working on a specific subject, the background chalkboard text occasionally reflects a different subject, because the background was drawn by someone working from a general classroom background reference rather than from the episode's specific classroom content. Bart's skateboard, one of the show's most iconic visual elements, appears in subtly different configurations across the series. The deck graphics change, the wheel color changes, the overall proportions of the board shift slightly. These are very small variations, the kind that are invisible unless you're specifically watching for them, but they accumulate across seasons into a skateboard that is recognizably Bart's skateboard while also being a slightly different object in different episodes. The church that Homer and Flanders both attend, the First Church of Springfield under the spiritual guidance of Reverend Lovejoy, has been depicted with its interior in significantly different configurations in different episodes. The arrangement of the pews, the position of the pulpit relative to the nave, the presence or absence of specific architectural features like side aisles and choir lofts, these elements change between episodes. The church's exterior has a similarly fluid relationship with consistency. Moe's Tavern has had at least 3 different bar layouts across the show's run, with the bar itself, the seating areas, the television set, the sign for the establishment, and the back area where Moe does things the show declines to specify, all occupying different configurations in different seasons. The tavern feels consistent as a place, because its character and its atmosphere are consistent, but its physical layout is not a fixed thing. The school bus that takes Springfield's children to and from Springfield Elementary has changed its specific model and markings across the series. The driver, Otto, is consistent. The bus he drives is less so. The interior of the bus, including the arrangement of seats and the location of the emergency exit, has been drawn differently in different episodes. Nelson Muntz's home situation is a source of ongoing inconsistency. His mother appears and disappears across the series, with her presence in his life ranging from essentially absent to occasionally present. The specific nature of his family arrangements, including whether his father is alive or in what country he might be found, is referenced differently in different episodes. Nelson's home itself is depicted differently across appearances, sometimes as a relatively normal house in a different income bracket than the Simpson home, sometimes as something too iterably more rundown. The specific rules of the Quickie Mart, including its hours of operation, the prices it charges, the products it carries, and the nature of Apu's employment there, are all handled with episodic flexibility. In some episodes, Apu is the owner of the Quickie Mart. In others, he is an employee of the corporate Quickie Mart chain, owned by a character called the Quickie Mart CEO or similar. The question of whether Apu owns his store or franchises it from a corporation is answered differently in different episodes and is never definitively resolved. The Shelbyville rivalry, which is one of Springfield's defining external relationships, is characterized differently across episodes. The nature of what distinguishes Springfield from Shelbyville, the history of the rivalry, and the specific differences between the two towns are treated as variable. In some episodes, the rivalry is ancient and visceral. In others, it's more casual. The specific founding history, touched on in the beloved Lemon of Troy episode, is the most detailed account of the Springfield-Shelbyville split, but that account's implications for the town's current relationship aren't maintained consistently in subsequent episodes that reference Shelbyville. The Springfield tire fire, which has been burning for an indeterminate period and is referenced as one of Springfield's most enduring civic problems, has been in different locations relative to other Springfield landmarks across different episodes. Its size and intensity vary. The question of who is responsible for it and whether any effort is being made to extinguish it is handled differently in different episodes. Ralph Wiggum, the police chief's son and one of the show's most beloved background characters, has had his specific cognitive characteristics portrayed across a wider range than you might initially expect. In early episodes, Ralph is simply a slightly spacey child with an overactive imagination and a tendency toward non sequitur. In later episodes, this quality has been amplified to the point where Ralph exists in an almost entirely separate perceptual reality from other characters, capable of statements that suggest a fundamentally different relationship with cause, effect, and the generally agreed-upon nature of things. The continuity of Ralph's specific level of disconnection from shared reality is not tracked in a way that makes him a fully consistent character across all his appearances. The Springfield Isotopes baseball team, the town's major professional sports franchise, has had its stadium, its roster, and its general performance level characterized differently in different episodes. The team's mascot, its colors, and the general quality of its play are handled episodically rather than consistently. The famous episode Hungry, Hungry Homer, where Homer discovers a plot to move the Isotopes to Albuquerque, established a specific and memorable piece of Springfield's civic life. Subsequent episodes reference the Isotopes in ways that don't always track the implications of that episode. Burns's various animals, including the hounds he releases on unwanted visitors and the various exotic creatures he has kept at different points in the series, are handled inconsistently. The number and type of hounds at the plant varies. Their specific role in Burns's security arrangements changes. The dogs themselves appear in different numbers in different scenes within the same episode. The Springfield Shopper, the town's newspaper, has been depicted with different staff, different editorial policies, different story coverage, and different visual presentation across the episodes in which it appears. The paper exists consistently as a background presence in Springfield's civic life, but its specific character is determined by what the current episode needs it to be. The local television station, Channel 6, and its programming, including the Krusty the Clown Show and various news broadcasts, is handled with episodic flexibility. The studio where Channel 6 produces its programming, the specific staff employed there, the technical quality of its broadcasts, and the range of programming it offers all vary. The relationship between Krusty's show and the station's other programming is not consistently characterized. Krusty's history with his television program, including the specific number of years he has been on the air, the precise nature of his contract with the station, and the various behind-the-scenes scandals and near cancellations his show has experienced, are referenced differently in different episodes. Krusty's career has been almost canceled, definitively canceled, successfully revived, and going strong in different episodes of the series, sometimes within the same season. The relationship between the Simpsons and their neighborhood more broadly, including their specific relationships with neighbors beyond Ned Flanders, is handled inconsistently. Characters who are established in one episode as familiar neighbors, people the Simpsons have known for years and have specific relationships with, appear in other episodes as strangers or are not present at all. The specific character of Evergreen Terrace as a neighborhood community is treated as whatever the current episode needs it to be. Homer's allergies, when they appear, are inconsistent with each other, and with the absence of allergies in episodes where they would be relevant. Homer's various food preferences and aversions are not consistently maintained. His specific relationship with certain foods, while his general love of donuts and his complicated relationship with broccoli are consistent, has been contradicted enough times to make a comprehensive list of Homer's dietary preferences an exercise in structured contradiction. Marge's specific professional history, beyond her primary characterization as a homemaker, includes various jobs and ventures across the series that have left varying traces on her characterization. Her time at the nuclear plant, her career as a police officer, her real estate license, her painting, her various business ventures, all of these are elements of her history that are present in individual episodes and variably present across the show's broader run. Lisa's academic situation at Springfield Elementary, including her specific grade level, her relationship with her teachers, and the precise nature of her academic acceleration relative to her classmates, is handled with the show's standard episodic flexibility. She is sometimes explicitly ahead of her classmates academically. In others, she functions as a more typical student at the grade level appropriate for her age, with her intelligence manifesting in ways other than advanced coursework. Bart's academic failures, which are one of his defining characteristics, are occasionally contradicted by episodes where he demonstrates genuine academic competence or achieves results that his established academic record would not predict. These contradictions generally serve the story being told in that episode, but they sit in tension with the broader characterization of Bart as a student who struggles consistently. Maggie's development, or the absence of it, is the most philosophically interesting continuity issue in the show. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She has been offered solid food and rejected it. She has been in situations that would, for a real infant, produce observable development. The show acknowledges that she exists in a state of developmental suspension, while also occasionally showing her capabilities that exceed what a 1-year-old should possess. The two aspects of her characterization coexist because they serve different purposes in different episodes. And then there is the couch. The Simpson family couch, which appears in the opening sequence of every episode and which is the staging ground for the couch gag, is a piece of furniture whose specific physical reality changes across the series in ways that are probably invisible to most viewers, but become visible under sustained attention. Its color has shifted. Its cushion arrangement has changed. Its relationship to the television set and the rest of the room's furniture has varied. The couch is the show's most iconic object, its most repeated image, and it is not the same couch in every episode. It is recognizably the couch. It is always the couch. But the couch that Homer falls onto in Season 2 is not quite the couch that the family crowds onto in Season 20. The same couch, changed by time and the hands of many artists, still doing the same job, still the center of the same family's life. That's Springfield. Changed and unchanged. Wrong and exactly right. Stay as long as you need to. Number section 13. The sound of Springfield audio errors, mismatched lines, and the voice that didn't match the mouth. There is a particular kind of mistake that lives in the space between what you see and what you hear, and The Simpsons, across its enormous run, has accumulated a remarkable collection of them. Audio errors are among the least discussed category of production mistake in animated television, partly because most viewers aren't watching with the specific attention required to catch them, and partly because the nature of animation production makes them almost inevitable at the scale the show operates. Let's start with the simplest version of this kind of error, which is the lip sync problem. In live-action television, lip sync errors are essentially impossible to miss because you can see the actor's mouth moving and hear the words simultaneously, and any mismatch is immediately obvious. In animation, the relationship between a character's mouth movements and the words coming out is already a constructed one. The voice recording happens before the animation, generally, and the animators then draw the mouth movements to match the recorded audio. This process introduces a potential gap between what was recorded and what was drawn, and in the case of a show producing 22 or more episodes per season across more than 3 decades, that gap occasionally becomes visible. There are episodes where a character's mouth continues moving slightly after they've finished speaking, a leftover frame of open-mouth animation that wasn't caught in the editing process. There are episodes where the mouth movement is slightly ahead of or behind the spoken line, a timing error that in live action would result in a retake but in animation might be caught too late to cost-effectively fix. There are episodes where a character is clearly in the middle of speaking when the camera cuts away, and the line that continues over the cut doesn't quite match what the character's visible mouth shape suggested they were about to say. The Krusty the Clown character is a particularly interesting case for lip sync observation because his makeup and exaggerated features mean that his mouth movements are already stylized, already somewhat removed from naturalistic mouth movement, which both make certain lip sync errors less obvious and occasionally makes them more obvious when the exaggeration is applied in the wrong direction. There are episodes where Krusty's mouth is moving in a general approximation of the words being spoken rather than a specific match, which is sometimes an intentional stylistic choice for a character defined by his performance artifice, and sometimes simply a production timing issue. Homer's voice, provided by Dan Castellaneta across the entirety of the show's run, is one of the most distinctive and beloved voice performances in American animation. It is also a voice that has changed meaningfully across 36 years, in ways that create a particular kind of audio continuity error when the show uses flashback sequences that are ostensibly set in the past. A scene depicting Homer in his 20s, drawn to look younger but voiced with the Homer voice of season 18 or season 25, produces a subtle wrongness that the ear catches before the mind fully identifies it. The Homer who existed in the past sounds like the Homer of the present because the same voice actor recorded the line, and the recording doesn't age backward. This is an issue that affects essentially all long-running animated shows with consistent cast, and there's no clean solution to it. You can't ask an actor to artificially age their performance backward, or not convincingly. But the result is that flashback sequences in The Simpsons have a general quality of sounding present tense, even when they're set in the past, which adds to the timeline's overall fluid and somewhat dreamlike quality. There are episodes where a line is clearly delivered by one performer and attributed in the visual presentation to a different character. These are rare, but they exist. The most common version involves characters in group scenes, where the specific source of a line is sometimes ambiguous, and the animation draws the response from a character who wasn't the one the audio indicated was speaking. There are crowd scenes in Springfield where a piece of dialogue clearly originates with one identifiable character based on voice, but the editing attributes it to someone nearby who happened to have their mouth slightly open. The alien noise. In several episodes across the series, particularly in earlier seasons, there is a brief audio artifact that has been described by fans as resembling a very faint alien vocalization. It appears in certain quiet moments, seems to originate in the lower frequencies of the audio mix, and has been noted appearing in multiple episodes in the same season, suggesting it was introduced at the mixing stage rather than being a production error in individual recordings. Whether this is genuinely a strange artifact of the audio mixing process, a piece of ambient sound design that was accidentally introduced to the final mix, or simply the kind of audio quirk that takes on mythological significance when applied to a show with a sufficiently devoted fanbase, is not definitively established. But it has been noted, documented, and discussed with the same earnest attention that the show's visual errors receive. Sound effects in The Simpsons are drawn from a library that has been expanded and modified across the show's run. The same sound effect is sometimes used in contexts where it's slightly wrong for the action being depicted, because the sound effect library was used as a reference rather than a custom-designed solution. There are explosions that sound identical across episodes because they're the same audio file. There are crowds that use the same murmur loop. There are cars whose engine sounds don't match their visual presentation. None of this is unusual for a long-running animated show, but the accumulated effect is a sonic world that is internally slightly inconsistent in ways that parallel its visual inconsistency. The music in particular is an interesting case. Alf Clausen, who composed the show's score for most of its run, created a musical vocabulary for Springfield that is extraordinarily specific, recognizable, and well-suited to the show's blend of comedy and occasional genuine emotion. The music does the show's emotional work with considerable craft. But there are episodes where the music cue chosen for a scene was clearly selected from the library before the final edit of the scene was locked, and the music therefore hits slightly wrong moments, builds to slightly wrong peaks, or resolves on slightly wrong beats relative to the action. These are editing decisions as much as music decisions, but the result is occasionally a scene where the music and the image are slightly out of emotional alignment. There's also the specific matter of Homer's famous cry of shock and distress, which has been rendered differently across different seasons and different scenes, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, sometimes with a falling pitch, sometimes with a rising one. The consistency of this specific sound effect, which is one of the most recognizable in American popular culture, is actually slightly less perfect than its iconic status would suggest. There are versions of it in the show that sound like close approximations rather than exact reproductions, because the line was recorded in a new session and the precise character of the vocal performance shifted. The dialogue delivery in scenes that involve Homer reading something aloud, signs, letters, instructions, has an interesting inconsistency across the show's run. In some episodes, Homer reads text exactly as it appears on screen, and the mouth animation matches his reading. In other episodes, he reads a simplified or paraphrased version of the text, with the animation drawn to the simplified version. In still others, he reads text that isn't visible on screen, implying the text existed in the script but was cut from the animation in post-production. Background music in Moe's Tavern is one of the show's longest-running audio inconsistencies. The tavern is established as a dive bar with a specific, somewhat depressing character, and its music should reflect that. In some episodes, there is appropriate ambient music for a Springfield dive bar. In others, the music is wrong for the space, using cues that would be more appropriate for a different kind of venue. In still others, there is no ambient music at all, which is occasionally correct for a scene that needs silence, and occasionally simply an absent element that should have been added. The Springfield Elementary announcements, delivered over the PA system by Principal Skinner, have audio quality that is theoretically meant to sound like a school PA system, slightly tinny, slightly compressed. In some episodes, this audio character is consistent and specific. In others, the PA delivery sounds essentially identical to normal dialogue, with no filtering applied to suggest the mediation of the PA system. The inconsistency suggests the audio processing for PA announcements was applied inconsistently in post-production. And then there is the question of phone calls, which are among the most technically specific audio situations in any drama or comedy. A phone call requires two parties to be recorded, and the audio for the person on the other end of the line should sound like it's been mediated by the telephone, filtered, slightly reduced in quality, placed spatially in a way that suggests it's coming from a small speaker. In The Simpsons, this audio treatment is applied inconsistently. Some phone conversations have both sides treated as if they're in the same room. Others apply the telephone filter correctly. Still, others apply it to both sides of the conversation, which would mean both parties sound like they're calling each other from the same telephone. These are small things. They're the kind of things that slip past on first viewing, second viewing, 20th viewing. They live in the texture of the show rather than in its foreground. But they're there, patient and accumulated, part of the enormous, invisible catalog of small imperfections that make Springfield what it is. A world built by human hands, to human standards, which is to say, not quite perfect, not quite consistent, but recognizable, familiar, and somehow entirely itself despite everything. Number. Section 14. The name problem characters who forget their own histories. One of the more quietly strange categories of Simpsons continuity error involves characters who, across different episodes, seem to forget their own names, their own families, and their own biographical facts. This isn't about the floating timeline or the way backstories get rewritten to accommodate the advancing present. It's about individual errors within episodes, moments where a character refers to themselves or their past in a way that contradicts what the show has established about them. Usually because the writer of that episode was working from their own memory of the show, rather than from a comprehensive fact check. Ned Flanders is a particularly interesting case here. Ned is one of the show's most detailed supporting characters, with an established history, an established family, an established set of religious convictions, and an established set of personality traits. He is also a character who has, across different episodes, referred to his history in ways that don't quite match. The episode that reveals his backstory with the behavioral modification therapy is genuinely groundbreaking for his character. But the implications of that backstory specifically, what it means for his stated experiences growing up, his relationship with his parents, the timeline of when the therapy occurred create tensions with things Ned has said about his childhood in other episodes. There are episodes where Ned refers to his parents in ways that suggest a warmer memory of them than the behavioral modification revelation would produce. There are episodes where his stated age at various life events doesn't quite track with the detailed timeline the show establishes elsewhere. There are references to his education and his early life that sit in tension with each other. None of this is unusual for a character who appears across hundreds of episodes written by many different writers. The continuity of Ned's inner life is maintained at the level of broad character traits, his faith, his patience, his underlying intensity, while the specifics of his biography are handled with episodic freedom. Chief Wiggum presents a similar pattern. His corruption, his incompetence, and his specific relationship with Springfield's criminal class are consistent. His biographical details are not. The number of years he has been chief of police, the specific circumstances under which he achieved that position, his relationship with various Springfield institutions, and certain details of his personal history are referenced differently across different episodes. There are episodes where Wiggum appears to have a long-established tenure as chief. There are others where he seems relatively new to the position, or where his history with the department is described in ways that don't match his established history. Kearney, one of Bart's tormentors at Springfield Elementary, has perhaps the show's most extreme biographical inconsistency in his stated status as a father. Kearney is established at various points as having a child, which places him in a peculiar position given that he is ostensibly a student at Springfield Elementary alongside Bart, who is 10. The show never quite reconciles these facts. The age at which Kearney actually became a father relative to his current age, and the specific circumstances of his domestic situation, are treated with the show's standard episodic flexibility, which in this case means that Kearney's status as a parent is raised when it's useful for a joke and ignored when it's not. Sideshow Bob's family situation is one that was expanded across the show's run with considerable care relative to most secondary characters. His brother Cecil, his mother, the Terwilliger family background, these are developed with real attention. But even within this relatively careful characterization, there are episodes where the specific details of Bob's history don't quite align. His education at Oxford is established and consistent. The details of his theatrical career before Krusty's show are less consistently referenced. The timeline of his various crimes and imprisonments, when laid out carefully, has gaps and contradictions that suggest individual episodes were written with attention to the character's broad history, but without checking the specific chronology. Apu Nahasapi Mapetalon's family, which expanded dramatically with the introduction of his arranged marriage and subsequent octuplets, is one of the show's most discussed cases of a supporting character's life being complicated in ways that couldn't fully be maintained across subsequent seasons. His wife, Manjula, his 8 children, his extended family, all of these elements were introduced with comedic and occasionally emotional care, and then were maintained at varying levels of consistency across subsequent years. There are episodes where the Nahasapi Mapetalon household is referenced in ways that don't quite match the established family situation. The octuplets, in particular, who would age noticeably in a show that maintained consistent timeline, are treated with the same temporal suspension as the rest of Springfield's population, which creates its own category of inconsistency. Professor Frink's specific academic credentials and areas of expertise have shifted across the show's run in ways that reflect the show's use of him primarily as a comic device for scientific exposition, rather than as a character with a fixed biography. In some episodes, he is specifically a physicist. In others, his expertise extends into biology, chemistry, engineering, and fields that are less clearly defined. His relationship with Springfield's academic and research institutions is established differently in different episodes. His personal history, including his father and certain elements of his backstory, were developed in specific episodes with more care, but the broader characterization of his academic life is episodically variable. Snake Jailbird, who has perhaps the most memorable character name in Springfield, is another case where the biographical specifics accumulate inconsistently. His criminal history, the specific crimes he has committed, his relationship with the Springfield police, and his domestic situation have all been referenced in different configurations across different episodes. The general character type career criminal, mullet, specific vernacular is highly consistent. The details of his actual biography less so. Mayor Quimby, whose Kennedy-adjacent political identity is one of the show's most durable satirical constructs, has had his specific history as Springfield's mayor characterized differently across the series. The length of his tenure, the specific corruption charges he has faced and evaded, his family situation, and the exact nature of his political machine are handled with the consistency of the type rather than the consistency of the biography. Quimby is always corrupt, always vaguely Kennedy-esque, always politically self-serving. The specific facts of his career are variable. Dr. Nick Riviera, whose casual medical malpractice has made him one of Springfield's most beloved supporting characters, has had his specific lack of qualifications characterized in different ways. The exact nature of his medical training, or the absence of it, is treated differently in different episodes. His patient relationship, his relationship with the medical establishment, and his specific areas of medical negligence are variable. The character type, incompetent, cheerful, dangerous, is consistent. The biography is episodically determined. What makes this category of error particularly interesting, and perhaps particularly forgivable, is that it reflects something true about how large groups of people maintain shared knowledge about complex subjects. The writers of The Simpsons know the show deeply, but no individual writer knows the entirety of it precisely. Memory fills in gaps. Assumptions substitute for facts. The specific detail that would create a contradiction is sometimes simply not the detail that comes to mind when a scene is being written. And so, characters in Springfield, like people in real life, occasionally misremember their own histories, or report them slightly differently depending on who's asking and what story is being told. It's not a perfect justification, it is a human one. And Springfield, for all its impossibility, has always been a human place. Section 15. The color of Springfield palette errors, wardrobe inconsistencies, and the yellow that isn't always yellow. Color in animation is not an incidental detail. It's a structural decision, a choice that is made at the character design level and then maintained or not maintained across every subsequent frame in which that character appears. In live-action television, costume and makeup continuity is managed by dedicated departments whose job is exactly that. In animation, the equivalent function is managed by model sheets, reference documents, and the collective attention of an animation staff that, at the scale The Simpsons operates, is spread across many hands in multiple countries and production facilities. The result across 36 seasons is a color continuity situation that is mostly very good and occasionally in the specific and gentle way that makes Springfield interesting, not quite right. Homer's stubble is the classic example. Homer is a man who canonically has a 5 o'clock shadow, a perpetual and specific amount of facial hair growth that is part of his design. The shadow is visible in close-up shots and in certain lighting conditions in medium shots. In wide shots and certain background appearances, it is sometimes absent. The decision about when Homer's face is close enough to the viewer to require the stubble to be drawn is made differently by different animators working on different scenes, resulting in a Homer whose face is variably smooth or slightly shadowed depending on where the camera is and who was drawing him. This extends to the specific shade of Homer's skin, the yellow that covers essentially every Springfield resident. The precise value of this yellow, which reads as a specific and recognizable hue, is not perfectly consistent across all 36 seasons of the show. The early seasons used a slightly different process for color reproduction than later digital production pipelines, which created a genuine shift in how Springfield's palette was rendered. But even within any given season, the specific yellow of Homer's skin varies slightly between scenes and between episodes, in ways that are invisible to casual viewing, but visible when frames from different episodes are placed side by side. Marge's hair, which is one of the show's most immediately recognizable visual elements, maintains its blue-gray tone across the show's run with considerable consistency. The exact shade of blue has shifted very slightly over the decades. The height of the tower, which is one of the show's most elastic visual elements, sometimes exaggerated enormously for comic effect, sometimes drawn at its nominal height, is not always consistent within individual episodes. There are scenes where Marge's hair height changes between cuts in a single conversation, because different angles of the scene were drawn with slightly different assumptions about how tall the hair should be. Bart's yellow skin has the same general character as Homer's, with the same minor variations. More interesting is the specific shade of his shirt, which is an orange-red that has been rendered in slightly different ways across the show's run. Viewers who have watched the show across multiple platforms and in multiple formats have noted that the specific color of Bart's shirt reads differently depending on the mastering of the video, which is partly a display and encoding issue, and partly a genuine variation in how the color was specified in different production eras. Lisa's red dress, which is the most consistent and characterful piece of clothing in the show's visual vocabulary, has been drawn in slightly different shades of red, in different seasons and different scenes. The dress's specific design, its collar, its length, its fit, is also subject to minor variation across the show's run. These are not dramatic variations. They're the small differences that accumulate across many hands, drawing the same character. Maggie's pink onesie, the other most consistent piece of clothing in the show, follows the same pattern. Consistent at the character level, occasionally slightly variable at the specific production level. The bow in her hair has been drawn in slightly different sizes and positions across different episodes. The secondary characters present more extreme cases. Characters who appear relatively infrequently have fewer model sheet references and less accumulated production experience, keeping their specific colors consistent. There are characters whose shirt color changes across their appearances. Characters whose skin tone is slightly different in their featured episode than in background appearances. Characters whose hair color has shifted between seasons. The most extreme version of this is in the very large crowd scenes, which are a feature of Springfield's civic life town meetings, sporting events, school assemblies. In these scenes, background characters are often drawn with general human color palettes, rather than with Springfield's specific yellow skin aesthetic. You can sometimes see, in a large Springfield crowd, a handful of people whose skin is a more realistic peachy tan, who read visually as outsiders even though they're not, because the background artist drawing the 100th crowd member defaulted to a realistic skin color rather than Springfield's specific yellow. Burns's color presents its own specific case. His skin is a gray that is specific to his character, distinct from the yellow of other Springfield residents. This gray is generally consistent, but its precise value varies. In certain scenes, particularly in earlier seasons, his skin reads as closer to white. In others, it's a more pronounced gray. The specific shade has shifted across the show's run in ways that reflect both the genuine evolution of the show's color process and the occasional individual production decision. Smithers's skin is similarly specific and similarly subject to minor variation. More interesting is the famous error in his very first appearance, where he was colored with dark skin, an error immediately corrected in subsequent episodes and attributed to a color assignment error in production. This is one of the most documented single-frame errors in the show's history, and it's notable precisely because the correction was so complete and so swift. It's a case where the production machinery identified and fixed a problem, rather than allowing it to persist. The Springfield Gorge, which is one of the show's most iconic locations, has been depicted in different colors across its appearances. The gorge's depth, width, and specific geological appearance are variable, but its color is also inconsistent, ranging from the warm tans and oranges of a desert gorge to cooler grays in other appearances. This reflects both the different artistic styles of different background painters who worked on the show and the simple practical reality that a specific location background is not always pulled from the original reference and reused. Exactly. Sometimes it's redrawn. The school itself, Springfield Elementary, has been painted different colors across the seasons. Its exterior has been depicted in warm beige, in a more yellowish tone, and in other variations. The specific institutional green that characterizes its interior has similarly varied. The combination of different background artists working across many seasons and the transition from hand-painted backgrounds to digital production created a Springfield that is consistent in feeling and character, but not in precise color specification. The blue sky above Springfield, which is the show's default background for exterior scenes, is one of the most variable colors in the show's palette. It ranges from a very pale near white to a vivid mid-blue, to something approaching the saturated blues of golden hour animation. The specific character of a Springfield exterior scene changes meaningfully depending on the sky treatment, which was handled differently by different artists and in different production eras. Night in Springfield has been rendered with particular inconsistency. A nighttime exterior in the early seasons looks different from a nighttime exterior in the middle seasons, which looks different from a nighttime exterior in the most recent seasons. This reflects genuine evolution in how animation handles dark environments rather than being a strict error, but the result is a Springfield whose nights are tonally inconsistent across its run. And then there is the specific yellow of the Simpsons house, which is one of the world's most recognizable fictional addresses, and which has been depicted in slightly different yellows across the show's run, in a range from a warm golden yellow to something closer to a pale or whitish yellow. The house is always recognizably itself. Its specific color is not fixed. This is fine. Color variation of this kind is expected in long-running animation production, and the overall visual vocabulary of Springfield is so specific and so well established that minor variations in exact color values don't undermine the show's identity. But they're there, accumulated across 36 years of production, a gentle reminder that Springfield is not a single image but an enormous collection of images made by many people over a very long time. Each slightly different, each entirely Springfield. Number. Section 16. The prop department of Springfield objects that change, disappear, and return. Every physical object in Springfield is a drawing, which means every physical object in Springfield can be different in every frame if the artist drawing that frame makes a different choice. Props in animation don't have the stubborn physical persistence of real objects. A coffee mug on a real set stays the same coffee mug throughout the scene. A coffee mug in Springfield is redrawn in every frame it appears, which means it is technically a different coffee mug each time, sharing only as much with its prior version as the artist's consistency allows. Most of the time, this process produces consistent props. The animators have model sheets, the props are established visual elements, and the production process maintains a reasonable degree of consistency in the appearance of objects that appear frequently. But most of the time is not all of the time, and 36 seasons is a very long time. Homer's car, the family's pink sedan, is perhaps the show's most prominent and consistently visible vehicle. It is also a vehicle whose specific model, precise shade of pink, interior configuration, and various minor physical details have changed across the show's run. The car's color is the most immediately visible variation. It ranges from a fairly saturated pink to a pale pinkish white, depending on the episode and the lighting of the scene. The car's interior, when visible, is not always the same shade or configuration. The specific model of car the pink sedan represents has been debated, with different episodes depicting it with slightly different body styles. More interesting is what happens to Homer's car when the episode requires it to be damaged, destroyed, or otherwise physically compromised. The car is demolished with some regularity across the show's run, and its condition between episodes is not tracked. The car that was crushed, burned, or driven off a cliff in one episode is perfectly fine in the next, and this reset is handled without comment, which is simply how the show works. But there are also episodes where the car's condition changes within the episode without explanation, where a dent visible in one scene is absent in the next, where damage sustained during a sequence isn't present in subsequent shots of the vehicle, because the background or secondary shot was produced before the damage was established. The family's kitchen has several objects that change across episodes. The refrigerator, which is a major set piece in a show that features Homer's eating habits as a recurring subject, has been depicted in different colors, with different internal configurations, and with different external decorations across the series. The specific magnets, drawings, and notes attached to the refrigerator door are not consistently maintained. Family photos, children's drawings, and other ephemera that would naturally accumulate on a refrigerator over time appear and disappear between episodes. The television set in the family's living room has changed models across the series in a way that generally reflects the advancement of television technology. The family watched a tube television set in the early seasons. They upgraded to a flat screen in later years. This evolution is broadly consistent with the show's floating timeline approach, where the present is always the viewer's present. But the specific model of the television, its precise dimensions, and its placement relative to the couch have been depicted inconsistently within certain seasons and across the broader run. Homer's workstation at the Springfield Nuclear Power Plant Sector 7G is one of the show's most iconic set pieces. It is also a set piece whose specific configuration changes between episodes and sometimes between scenes within episodes. The specific arrangement of Homer's desk, the items on the control panel, the appearance of the safety equipment that Homer is supposed to monitor but consistently ignores, and the specific ergonomic horrors of his workstation are depicted differently in different episodes. The donut that Homer keeps at his workstation appears in some episodes and not others. The specific buttons and screens of the control panel shift between visits. The Quickie Mart's interior has changed meaningfully across the show's run. The specific arrangement of its shelves, the products visible on those shelves, the location of the counter relative to the entrance, and the specific equipment behind the counter have all been configured differently in different episodes. The squishy machine, which is one of the store's most recognizable features, has been positioned differently across the show's appearances in the Quickie Mart. The specific flavors available, visible as labels on the machine, are a lovely source of minor continuity inconsistency as they change between episodes. Marge's pearls, which are one of her most consistent and recognizable accessories, are depicted with minor variation in their specific shade, size, and the number of pearls in the strand. These variations are subtle and invisible at the speed of normal viewing. They're visible in still frames. The pearls are always pearls. They're not always exactly the same pearls. Homer's trademark donut is another object that is central enough to the show's iconography that minor variations in its depiction are more noticeable than they might be for a less iconic object. The donut's glaze, its specific shade of pink, the size and color of the sprinkles when they appear, and the precise shape of the donut itself have all been depicted with minor variations across the show's run. The donut is always recognizable. Its exact specifications change. Maggie's pacifier, which is her most defining visual element, follows the same general pattern as the donut and the pearls. It is always a pacifier. Its specific shape, size, and color have minor variations across different episodes and different eras of the show's production. The pacifier is a very small object to be drawing thousands of times across 36 years, and the accumulated variation is understandable. Bart's slingshot has been depicted in slightly different sizes and configurations across the show's run. The rubber band on the slingshot, when visible, has been colored differently in different episodes. The slingshot's use in actual pranks and events within episodes is consistent with its established function, but its visual depiction is subject to the same minor production variation as every other object in Springfield. The bowling ball, which appears in the show's opening sequence and which has been the subject of its own famous continuity discussion regarding where exactly it goes after Homer bowls it in the opening, is an object that appears occasionally in the show outside the opening credits. Its specific visual depiction is consistent with itself, but the opening credits sequence has been modified across the show's run in ways that affect how the bowling ball sequence plays out, and the specific details of what happens to the ball vary across different versions of the opening. Bart's room, which has been depicted in detail across many episodes, has had its specific furniture arrangement, wall decorations, and general state of entropy configured differently in different episodes. The specific posters on his walls change across seasons. The specific mess on his floor is inconsistently catastrophic. The placement of his bed relative to the window changes. The window itself has been drawn in slightly different positions relative to the room's other walls in different episodes. Lisa's room has a more consistent character, her organized, intellectually furnished space contrasting with Bart's disorder, but is also subject to the same minor variations in specific furniture placement, wall decoration, and room configuration. Her saxophone, which is one of the show's most recognizable objects, has been drawn in slightly different shades of brass and in slightly different configurations across different episodes. The specific layout of the Simpson house itself, which is a complex multi-room domestic space that has been depicted extensively across the series, is one of the most famous sources of architectural inconsistency in animated television. The relationship between the rooms, the specific dimensions of the staircase, the placement of the upstairs bedrooms relative to each other and to the bathroom, and the configuration of the kitchen relative to the living room are not perfectly consistent across all episodes. This is not a failing. It's a consequence of the scale and duration of the production. The house feels entirely real, entirely consistent, in the same way Springfield feels entirely real, as a place defined by its character and its emotional truth rather than by perfectly consistent physical specifications. You know this house. You know its smell and its particular light. You know the creak of its third stair, even though the show has never told you which stair creaks. You know it the way you know a place you've spent a long time in, not as a floor plan, but as a feeling. That's what Springfield is, a feeling that happens to have slightly inconsistent floors. Number. Section 17. The episode that contradicts itself. Intra-episode errors and the mistakes within single stories. Everything we've looked at so far has been about inconsistencies between episodes, the way one episode contradicts another, the way information established across the show's long run creates contradictions when laid end to end. But there is another category of Simpsons error that is in some ways more striking, which is the error that occurs within a single episode. The moment where one scene contradicts what happened in the scene before it. The prop that changes between shots? The fact established in Act 1 that Act 3 quietly ignores. These intra-episode errors are the ones that the production process is most specifically designed to catch. A continuity supervisor on a live-action production spends their entire workday watching for exactly this kind of mistake. In animation, the equivalent safeguard is the model sheet, the storyboard, and the multiple stages of review that a scene passes through before it's finished. These safeguards catch most intra-episode errors. They don't catch all of them. There are episodes where a character's clothing changes between scenes that are supposed to be continuous. A jacket that's present in one room is absent when the character moves to the next room, without any scene change or time break that would explain when the jacket was removed. This is the classic costume continuity error, and it appears in The Simpsons with the same frequency it appears in long-running live-action shows, which is not often, but often enough to notice if you're watching carefully. There are episodes where an object that's been broken, dropped, or otherwise destroyed in one scene is intact in the next. Homer drops a plate, the plate shatters. 2 scenes later, the plate is back in the cabinet whole. This sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not. The specific episode and scene varies, but the pattern is real. Objects in Springfield don't necessarily maintain the consequences of what happens to them within a single episode, let alone across episodes. There are scenes where the lighting of a space changes between cuts in ways that can't be explained by movement or time passing. A scene set in the living room during the day is lit with daylight in one shot. The next shot of the same scene is slightly darker, as if the light quality has changed. This can be the result of different background artists working on the scene's different shots and applying slightly different lighting conditions to each. There are scenes where the number of people in a room changes between cuts. A crowd scene that establishes 6 distinct characters in one shot contains 7 in the next, with the new character not having entered from anywhere in particular. This is one of the most common intra-episode errors in animated production, and is so common as to be essentially expected in any complex crowd scene. Characters also disappear between cuts, which is less expected and occasionally more jarring. The specific words on signs within episodes are a consistent source of intra-episode variation. A sign established with specific text in one shot sometimes has slightly different text in a subsequent shot of the same location. The Quick E-Mart sign is a recurring case. The signs in Springfield Elementary, the marquee of the Springfield Theater, which changes between shots more often than it would need to if anyone was watching. Homer's beer count is a beloved category of intra-episode error. In scenes where Homer is drinking, the specific number of cans or glasses visible in the scene and the level of the liquid in whatever he's currently drinking are not always consistent between cuts. Homer takes a long drink from a glass that appears full in the shot before and after the drink. Homer sets down an empty can that was half full 2 shots ago. These errors are minor and invisible at the speed of normal viewing, but they're there. The food at the Simpson dinner table is similarly inconsistent between shots. A scene establishes specific dishes on the table. A subsequent shot of the same scene includes dishes that weren't there before, or is missing dishes that were. The level of food in serving dishes changes. Marge's specific dish changes. The placement of condiments and serving implements shifts. Dinner table scenes are among the most challenging in any show with a large permanent set, because every element of the table has to be consistent across multiple shots from multiple angles, and the animated dinner table is redrawn from scratch for each angle. The height of characters relative to each other is subject to within-episode variation, particularly when a character who is usually seen alone or with one other character appears in a scene with multiple characters of different canonical heights. The show has established approximate height relationships between characters. Homer is taller than Marge, Bart and Lisa are child-sized, and these relationships are generally maintained, but the specific proportions shift slightly between shots, particularly in crowd scenes. The Simpson house's exterior, when seen from different angles in the same episode, has minor structural inconsistencies. The house is a specific design that has been drawn many times from many angles, and the specific details of its roofline, its windows, its porch, and its relationship to the Flanders house next door are not always perfectly consistent between shots, even within a single episode. Burns's office is a particularly interesting case for intra-episode consistency. It is a large and highly specific space that has been depicted many times across the series. Within individual episodes, its specific configuration, the placement of Burns's desk, the distance from the desk to the door, the height of the ceilings, the specific arrangement of the room's sinister decorations is occasionally slightly different between shots. This is the result of different background artists working on different shots of the same location, each working from the general reference of Burns's office rather than from precise measurements of the specific version established earlier in the same episode. The hospital, which is a location Springfield residents visit with alarming frequency, is one of the show's most internally variable settings. The general character of Springfield General Hospital is consistent, underfunded, casually dangerous, staffed by the local medical community, which is to say, staffed by people who should perhaps be doing something else. But the specific layout of the hospital, the configuration of the rooms, and the specific appearance of the equipment within it are handled differently across individual episodes and within individual episodes across different shots. The football field used by the Springfield Atoms when the show visits professional or semi-professional football events is depicted with different dimensions and configurations in different scenes within the same episode. This is a case where the background artist working on the wide shot of the stadium was working from a different reference than the artist working on the closer shots of the field, producing a space whose overall impression is consistent, but whose specific geometry isn't. The school cafeteria, which is one of Springfield Elementary's most frequently visited spaces, has had its specific layout vary within individual episodes. The line for food, the arrangement of tables, and the specific position of the serving counter relative to the entrance are not perfectly consistent between shots of the same lunchtime scene. And then there is the specific category of error, where a character's emotional state doesn't quite match between shots, where the expression that was established in one shot doesn't quite match the expression in the next, because the scene was animated in pieces and the emotional continuity of the character's face wasn't perfectly tracked across all the shots. This is a very subtle error, visible more as a vague sense that something is slightly off rather than as a specific identifiable mistake. But in scenes with genuine emotional weight, scenes where the show is doing something real and affecting this kind of subtle inconsistency can be the difference between a scene that lands and one that almost lands. Almost landing is fine. A show that runs for 36 years will always have more scenes that almost land than any production process can prevent. The remarkable thing isn't how many of these errors exist. The remarkable thing is how few there are, relative to the sheer volume of material produced. 36 seasons, 788 episodes, hundreds of thousands of individual frames, an almost incomprehensible number of individual production decisions, each of which had to be made correctly for the scene, the episode, and the season to be consistent. Most of them were made correctly. The ones that weren't are the subject of this particular kind of devoted, gentle attention. Springfield's imperfection is a measure of its abundance. There couldn't be this many small errors without there being this much show. And there couldn't be this much show without there being this many people who needed it, who watched it, who kept it going across 36 years and counting. The errors are part of the abundance. They always were. Number, section, 18. Letters, signs, and the written word in Springfield text errors and the typography of a fictional town. Springfield is a town full of text. Signs on shops, marquees on theaters, labels on products, newspapers, books, letters, graffiti, official documents. The show's writers and designers have always understood that a fictional world's written language is one of its richest sources of comedy and detail, and the text visible throughout Springfield is one of the great pleasures of careful Simpsons viewing. It is also one of the great sources of continuity error. The most famous category of Springfield text error involves signs that change their wording between episodes without any narrative explanation. A shop that is established with one name in one episode has a different name in another, not because the business changed ownership, but because the writer or designer working on the second episode used a different name, either from memory or as a deliberate new invention, without checking what the sign said in the episode where the location was previously established. The Springfield Elementary sign is one of the more famous cases. The school's formal name and the specific wording of the sign above its entrance has been depicted in slightly different configurations across different episodes. The sign that says Springfield Elementary School in one episode says something slightly different in another. The font and general design of the sign is consistent. The specific text sometimes isn't. The Quick E-Mart sign has been depicted with different text configurations across the show's run. The specific styling of the hyphen in Quick E-Mart, the font used, and the specific configuration of any additional text on the sign vary between episodes. In some appearances, the sign includes Apu's name or a tagline. In others, it's purely the store name. The consistency of this particular sign is somewhat better than many Springfield signs because the Quickie Mart is such a frequently visited location that its sign has been drawn many times by artists with the previous version as a reference. But it's not perfectly consistent. Moe's Tavern has had its sign vary between appearances in similar ways. The specific font, the styling, and in some cases the exact spelling have been rendered differently in different episodes. These are minor variations that don't change the meaning of the sign, but that reflect the individual choices of the many different artists who have drawn Moe's exterior across 36 years of production. The Springfield newspaper, the Springfield Shopper, is a particularly interesting case because it appears as a prop in the show. Characters read it, hold it, react to its headlines, and its headlines are therefore legible in many episodes. The Shopper's headlines are one of the show's most reliable sources of background comedy, written specifically for each episode with the absurdist wit that the show brings to all its background text. But the Shopper's masthead, its layout, and its general design have changed across the show's run, reflecting both genuine design evolution and the occasional error of using a different version of the prop than the one established in earlier appearances. The products visible in the Quick E-Mart and in the Simpsons kitchen cabinets and refrigerator are another source of text-level continuity inconsistency. Product names visible in the background of one episode are sometimes different in the same location in another episode, not because the characters changed their shopping habits, but because the background artist drew a different brand name, either as a new joke or simply as a different choice. Duff Beer, which is among the show's most visible fictional brands, is generally consistent in its branding. Less prominent background products are less consistently labeled. The graffiti in Springfield, which appears on overpasses, walls, and various public surfaces, is not consistent between appearances of the same location. This is appropriate for graffiti, which, by its nature, is not permanent and can change. But there are cases where the graffiti changes between shots within a single scene, which suggests that different artists working on different shots of the same location drew different graffiti, or drew no graffiti at all, producing a surface that is tagged in one angle and clean in another. Homer's work ID badge, which appears occasionally when the show's setting is the nuclear plant and security procedures are being observed, has been depicted with different configurations. The photo, the text, the layout of the ID, these have varied across the show's appearances of this prop. Given that ID badges are used primarily as a quick visual reference for a specific kind of scene rather than as a developed prop, the inconsistency is understandable. The content of letters and notes within the show is handled with interesting inconsistency. When a letter or note is read aloud, the spoken content is clear and specific. When the letter or note is visible on screen, the actual text sometimes doesn't match what's being read. This is an extremely common production shortcut in both live-action and animated production. The legible prop is produced separately from the spoken content, and they don't always precisely match. In The Simpsons, this disconnect is occasionally noticeable when a character holds up a visible note and reads from it, and the text on the note, when paused and read by a viewer, says something that differs from what's being said aloud. The Simpsons family mail, which arrives at their mailbox and is occasionally seen in detail, has text that doesn't always bear close inspection. Return addresses are sometimes not in any real city. The addressee is sometimes not quite right. The postal details are often fictional in ways that are consistent with the show's Springfield-specific geography, but that occasionally include specific errors, wrong zip code formats, impossible street addresses, mail addressed to the correct last name but the wrong first name. School report cards, which are a recurring prop for both Bart's academic struggles and Lisa's academic achievements, have text that is handled with variable care. The specific grades, the specific subjects listed, and the specific wording of teacher comments on these report cards are sometimes consistent with the episode's established content and sometimes drawn from a generic report card template that doesn't quite match the story. Legal documents, which appear whenever Burns is involved in a scheme that requires documentation or whenever a character is in some kind of official legal process, are another category of prop text that is written for visual plausibility rather than legal accuracy. The show plays this for jokes, and the joke text on legal documents is often extremely good, but it's also occasionally inconsistent with what characters say the documents say. Menus at the various Springfield restaurants, the Frying Dutchman, the Gilded Truffle, Café Kafka, the various fast food establishments have text that changes between the menu's appearance in different episodes and sometimes between shots within the same episode where a character is choosing from the menu. The specific items, their descriptions, and their prices vary. One of the most interesting categories of Springfield text is the show's in-world books. Springfield has a public library. Characters read books. The specific titles and text visible on book spines and covers in the library and in various characters' homes are a source of considerable comedy. The show uses these as background gags, cramming joke titles into every available bookshelf. But the specific books in various characters' collections are not consistently present across episodes. Lisa's bookshelf, which should be one of the show's most consistent details given her character, has different books in different episodes, including occasional books that seem inconsistent with her established reading level and interests. The whiteboard and chalkboard text in different professional settings, at the power plant, at the school, at the hospital, follows the same general pattern as the school chalkboard discussed earlier. Text that is specific and legible in a close shot becomes generic or absent in a wide shot because the wide shot background was drawn without referencing the specific text established in the close shot. All of this is fine. It's all fine. The text in Springfield is extraordinarily good, considered in aggregate. The background jokes, the sign comedy, the product names, the newspaper headlines, these are among the great pleasures of careful Simpsons viewing, and they've been produced across 36 years with consistent craft and considerable wit. The errors are there because the text is there. You can't have this much background comedy without occasionally getting a detail slightly wrong. The mistakes are the shadow cast by the abundance of the good stuff. Springfield is a very well-read fictional town. Its spelling is just occasionally approximate. Number. Section 918. The season-by-season shift. How the show's visual style changed and what it left behind. There is a version of Simpsons error that isn't quite an error in the conventional sense but functions like one when you place episodes from different eras of the show side by side. It's the visible shift in visual style that occurred as the show transitioned through different production methods, different animation studios, different executive producers with different visual priorities, and different technological eras. The Simpsons of Season 1 looks meaningfully different from The Simpsons of Season 8, which looks meaningfully different from The Simpsons of Season 18, which looks meaningfully different from The Simpsons of Season 32. These differences are real, documented, and in some ways the most honest record of 36 years of animation technology and aesthetic preference. But because the show maintains a fictional continuity across all these visual eras, the same characters, the same town, the same families, the stylistic differences between eras create a kind of continuity error at the level of look and feel. Characters who are redrawn using the tools and techniques of a later era appear slightly different from their earlier versions, even when the specific intention is to maintain their established design. The character is the same. The hand drawing the character has changed. The software rendering the character has changed. The character looks slightly different. The earliest seasons of the show, produced in the late 1980s and early 1990s, have a specific visual quality that is recognizable immediately. The characters are slightly more roughly drawn, with a looseness in the line work that reflects both the animation style of the period and the specific production constraints of the show's first seasons. The colors are different, warmer, slightly more muted, produced through the photographic and optical processes of the era rather than the digital processes that replace them. This visual character, which many longtime fans associate with the show's best period, was produced by a specific combination of production choices that couldn't simply be maintained as the industry transitioned to digital production. The hand-drawn warmth of the early seasons is a consequence of hand-drawn production. When production moved to digital, the look changed, not because anyone decided the show should look different, but because the tools changed. The transition seasons, roughly the middle of the show's run, have a visual style that reflects the transition period digitally produced but still relatively close to the hand-drawn aesthetic, cleaner than the earliest seasons but without the more polished look of the HD era. The HD era, which began around season 20, brought another meaningful visual shift. The show's aspect ratio changed. Its color palette became more saturated. The character designs were slightly adjusted to look better in widescreen high definition. These adjustments are subtle. The characters are still recognizably themselves, but they produce characters who are slightly different from their earliest versions. Within this broader visual history, there are specific cases where the show's visual consistency within a single era is disrupted by an episode that looks like it was produced in a different era. This happens occasionally when an episode is produced by a different overseas studio than the one handling the bulk of the season, or when production schedules create a situation where an episode goes through a different production pipeline than those around it. These outlier episodes are identifiable by a slight difference in line quality, color, or character rendering that places them slightly outside the visual context of the season they aired in. There are also episodes where individual scenes look like they were produced with different animation standards than the rest of the episode, which can reflect a scene being redone late in production by a different team, or a scene where the time available for polish was different from the surrounding scenes. The opening credits sequence has been revised multiple times across the show's run, and the visual quality of the opening has shifted along with the show's broader visual evolution. Watching a collection of opening sequences from across the show's 36 seasons is an efficient tour through the visual history of American television animation. You can see the production, technology, and aesthetic preferences of each era clearly in those 30 seconds. Character animation quality varies not just between eras but within episodes, depending on which scenes were given the most production attention and which were handled more quickly. In episodes with particularly ambitious action sequences or emotionally significant moments, the character animation is often more fluid, more detailed, and more carefully produced than the animation in the quieter connecting scenes around it. This is a standard allocation of production resources, and it's the correct choice. But it means that a single episode can have scenes that look meaningfully better than the scenes before and after them. Certain guest star appearances have prompted additional animation care. When a celebrity agreed to voice a character who was meant to appear in multiple scenes across an episode, the animation of those scenes sometimes received additional attention relative to the surrounding content, producing a slight visual upgrade around the guest character that is occasionally noticeable. The most extreme version of visual inconsistency across the show's run appears in clip shows episodes that combine new framing material with clips from previous episodes. These episodes place footage from different visual eras of the show in direct juxtaposition, which makes the visual differences between those eras more noticeable than they would be in either context separately. A clip from Season 3 embedded in a Season 10 episode looks noticeably different from the surrounding material, and that difference is more obvious in the context of the clip show than it would be watching Season 3 in sequence. This is not a production error in any strict sense. It's a consequence of producing a clip show in a long-running series with a visually evolving style. But the effect is of a show that looks slightly inconsistent with itself, which in a different framing is exactly what we've been talking about all along. Springfield looks like itself. Springfield also looks like many different versions of itself, produced by many different people across many different technological eras, each doing their best to maintain the identity of a place that exists only in drawing and memory. That's not an error. That's 36 years. And 36 years, in any medium, in any form, will always look like the accumulation of many different hands working toward the same thing at different points in their lives and their craft. Springfield is the sum of all those hands. The clean and the rough, the early and the late, the digital and the hand-drawn. It's all Springfield, and all of it is slightly different from the others, and all of it is exactly what it needs to be. Number, section, 20, The Simpsons Go Abroad, International Episode Errors, and The Springfield That Travels Badly. One of the features of The Simpsons' later seasons is the international episode, the premise where the family leaves Springfield for a foreign country, city, or cultural setting. These episodes are beloved for their specific kind of comedy, which derives from the Simpson family's specific kind of American tourist energy. Homer's indifference to context, Marge's anxious over-preparation, Bart's adaptation to whatever chaos the new environment offers, Lisa's earnest attempt to genuinely engage with a different culture. They are also, as a category, among the show's most concentrated sources of factual error, cultural inconsistency, and background detail mistakes. The research required to authentically represent a specific international location is extensive, and the production timeline of an animated show doesn't always allow for the level of research that would prevent every error. The result is international episodes where the representation of a specific country's geography, culture, language, and visual environment is mostly good, occasionally quite good, and sometimes specifically wrong in ways that are noticeable to viewers from those places. The episode set in Japan, which sent the family to the country for a storyline involving sumo wrestling and Japanese game show culture, is one of the more beloved international episodes and also one of the more discussed in terms of its cultural representation. Japanese viewers and critics have noted specific inaccuracies in the show's depiction of Japanese urban environments, specific anachronisms in its representation of Japanese cultural products, and places where the Japanese text visible in the episode contains errors. Some of these are intentional jokes, some are production errors. The distinction isn't always clear from the outside. The episode set in Australia, which involves Bart getting in trouble over a phone call and the family having to travel to deal with the consequences, is famous for its specific satirical take on Australian culture and for the specific response that satire generated in Australia. The episode plays deliberately and knowingly with cultural stereotypes, which is part of its comic point. Within that satirical frame, there are specific background details, maps, signs, visual representations of the Australian environment that are inaccurate in ways that go beyond deliberate exaggeration. Australian viewers have documented specific errors in how their country's geography and visual culture are represented. The episode set in Italy, which involves Homer discovering his Italian heritage and traveling to a specific small Italian town, has been examined by Italian viewers for accuracy. The specific depictions of Italian food, language, and architecture are generally better than in some of the show's other international episodes, but specific words on signs, specific geographical implications of the setting, and certain cultural details are handled with variable care. The episode set in Brazil received an extremely sharp response from Brazilian viewers and cultural commentators, who objected to specific elements of the episode's representation of Brazilian culture and urban environment. The show's response to this objection and the broader conversation about the episode's content became a story in itself. From a pure continuity and accuracy standpoint, the episode contains specific factual errors about Brazilian geography, urban planning, and cultural context that are documentable independently of the broader cultural representation debate. The episode set in Africa, which involves the family traveling for a nature documentary project, has its own set of geographic and cultural representation issues. The specific representation of the African environment, which is treated in places as a generic rather than specific geography, produces errors of both specificity, wrong details for the location implied, and generalization, treating a vast and diverse continent as a single setting. The European episodes, of which there are several, have a mixed record for accuracy. The episode set in England has specific errors in its representation of English culture, geography, and visual environment that are noticeable to British viewers. The episode set in France has similar issues. The episode set in Germany, which has a specific joke structure around German efficiency, has its own set of cultural representation decisions that sit in tension with each other. What makes these international episodes interesting from the perspective of errors and mistakes is that the errors they contain are a different kind from the production errors we've discussed elsewhere. They're not animation mistakes or continuity failures or timeline contradictions. They're research gaps, places where the production process didn't have enough specific information about a real location to represent it accurately, or where the available information wasn't checked against the actual details. These gaps are more visible in international episodes than in Springfield itself, because Springfield's rules are Springfield's own and can be adjusted to accommodate almost anything. A real country has a real geography, a real language, real signs that say specific things. When the show gets those specific things wrong, there's a correct answer to compare the error against. Springfield has no correct answer. Springfield is the answer to itself. The international episodes, in showing Springfield characters moving through real places and getting those real places occasionally wrong, actually clarify what Springfield is by contrast. Springfield is a place with the freedom to be wrong about its own details because its details belong only to itself. The world outside Springfield has less flexibility, and when Homer stares at a foreign sign and misreads it hilariously, and the foreign sign in the background is itself slightly wrong, there's a kind of charming recursion in the error. The show made a mistake representing a real place, but it made the mistake through the eyes of a character who would make exactly that mistake. The error and the comedy are the same thing, produced by the same source. Homer reads the world wrong. The world, in The Simpsons, is drawn slightly wrong. They deserve each other. Section 21. What the mistakes tell us. A final reflection on imperfection in Springfield. We have spent a long time in Springfield now. We've watched the backgrounds shift. We've seen characters appear and disappear. We've tracked the floating timeline across 36 years and watched it produce more contradictions than any continuity department could fully manage. We've looked at the colors that aren't quite right, the props that change between shots, the audio that doesn't always match the mouth, the text that says something different in a later episode. We've found what we came to find. Springfield is full of mistakes. And having found them, documented them, laid them out carefully in whatever light was available, I want to spend a moment on the thing that these mistakes actually are. They are evidence of production, evidence of process, evidence that an enormous number of people worked on this show across an enormous number of years, and that working on anything for that long and at that scale will always produce imperfection. Not because the people working on it weren't skilled, or weren't careful, or didn't care, but because scale and duration produce variation, and variation in the context of a continuous fictional world produces inconsistency. Every single person who worked on The Simpsons, the writers, the animators, the voice actors, the directors, the composers, the background painters, the storyboard artists, the editors, the color coordinators, the sound designers, the countless people whose names appear in the credits, and the even more countless people whose names don't, every single one of those people was trying to make something good. They were trying to make Springfield feel real, or feel funny, or feel true, or feel like the specific thing it needed to feel like in that episode for that story, for that character. Most of the time, they succeeded. The success rate, measured against the total output, is extraordinary. 788 episodes, many of which are genuinely great, many more of which are genuinely good, almost none of which fail completely. That's a production record that almost no other show in television history can match. The mistakes don't diminish that record, they're part of it. The imperfections of a thing this large and this long-running are inseparable from its existence. You cannot have 36 seasons without accumulating inconsistencies. You cannot have 788 episodes without eventually contradicting yourself. You cannot have thousands of hours of animation without somewhere, in the background of some scene in some episode, getting something slightly wrong. The fans who find and document these errors are doing something that looks like criticism but is actually something closer to love. You don't spend hours cataloging the mistakes in something you don't care about. You don't notice the stubble on Homer's face, or the inconsistent position of Moe's bar, or the specific text on a letter that doesn't match what the character said it said unless you've been watching carefully, and you don't watch carefully unless something in the show has earned your attention in the deepest way available. The mistakes are the shadow of the attention. Where the attention goes, the mistakes get found. And in Springfield, the attention has been going, steadily and devotedly, for 36 years. There are fans who have watched certain episodes more times than the people who made them. There are fans who know the show's timeline more accurately than most of its writers. There are fans for whom Springfield is genuinely one of the most familiar places in their entire experiential history, more familiar perhaps than some of the actual places they've lived. For those fans, the mistakes are part of the texture of a place they know intimately. The way you know the creak of a particular floorboard in a house you grew up in, or the way a specific tree's shadow falls in a yard you played in as a child. The imperfections aren't flaws. They're the specific character of a specific beloved thing. Springfield is wrong in specific ways. Those specific ways are part of what makes it Springfield. And there's something else, something quieter, that these mistakes carry. They carry time. Each production error, each continuity gap, each animation difference between seasons is a mark left by a specific moment in the show's long production history. The rough line work of Season 1 is evidence of 1989. The cleaner digital production of Season 20 is evidence of 2009. The specific jokes and the background signs are evidence of what was funny and relevant in the year they were written. The mistakes are archives. They preserve the specific conditions of their production in ways that the polished parts of the show don't always. A perfectly animated scene looks like it could have been made any time. A scene with the specific limitations of its production era visible in the animation looks exactly like when it was made. Springfield is a time capsule with bad continuity. Every inconsistency is a date stamp. Every error is evidence of a specific year, a specific production team, a specific set of artistic choices being made under a specific set of constraints. The show's imperfection is its most honest documentary record. And if you're watching late at night, in the particular quiet of whatever city or town you're in, wherever that is, and Springfield is playing softly on the screen, full of its lovely errors and its beloved inconsistencies and its characters who shouldn't be able to exist but do if you're watching, and the mistakes are part of the comfort rather than a distraction from it, then you understand something true about what a show like this is for. It's not for perfection. Perfection doesn't keep you company. Perfection doesn't feel like home. Springfield feels like home because it's familiar and flawed and consistent in all the ways that matter while being inconsistent in all the ways that don't. Its characters are always themselves, even when their colors are slightly wrong. Its family always loves each other, even when the house they live in isn't quite the same house it was in the episode before. Its stories always mean something, even when the timeline that produced them doesn't quite add up. The mistakes are fine. Springfield is fine. Homer is going to fall down. Marge is going to worry. Bart is going to cause trouble. Lisa is going to be right about something and be ignored. Maggie is going to be watching. And whatever time it is where you are right now, and wherever you are in the world, Springfield is there when you need it, imperfect and familiar, waiting. It always is. Number. Bonus section. The Completionist's Companion, an extended catalog of the gentle and the specific. If you are still here, truly still here, then this section is for you. This is the section that doesn't need to exist by any conventional script logic, but exists because there is always more. There is always another error, another inconsistency, another quiet little wrongness tucked into the background of a scene that someone watched 40 times before they noticed it. This section is not organized by theme or category. It's organized the way the errors themselves are organized, which is to say, not at all. It moves freely. It lingers where it wants to linger. It is the section for the small hours, for the specific kind of attention that late nights produce. Krusty the Clown's makeup. In episodes where Krusty appears without his stage makeup, episodes where we see the man underneath the performer, Herschel, Schmoikel, Pinchas, Yaruchim, Krustovsky, his makeup-free face is depicted with variable amounts of residual makeup. In some episodes, the transition from painted face to unpainted face is clean and complete. In others, traces of the white paint or the red accents remain in ways that don't match the previous shot. This inconsistency is particularly interesting because Krusty's identity is built on the gap between performer and performance, and the way his makeup is handled in any given scene reflects whether that episode is thinking about him as primarily a performer or as a person. The Springfield Elementary Gymnasium has hosted enough events across the show's run: talent shows, assemblies, graduations, sporting events, dances, that its configuration across all those appearances amounts to a fascinating record of a space being reconceived by many different background artists across many years. The stage that appears at one end of the gymnasium for some events is sometimes absent for events that would seemingly require it. The folding chairs that fill the space for assemblies are sometimes arranged in ways inconsistent with the seating configuration established earlier in the same episode. The bar at Moe's has had its specific glassware supply change across the show's run. In earlier seasons, the glasses behind the bar are a specific style. In later seasons, they've shifted. The bottles behind the bar are a reliable source of background comedy. Their specific labels, which are sometimes joke labels and sometimes generic, are not consistent across appearances of the bar's background in different episodes. Springfield Cemetery, which is a location that serves many different narrative functions across the show's run, has had its specific graves, its iron gate, its paths, and its general layout configured differently in different episodes. The specific grave markers visible in the background of cemetery scenes are not consistent between episodes. Named graves in the background of one episode sometimes don't appear in the same location in a subsequent visit to the same cemetery. The Simpson family's own specific family plot, when visible, is in different positions relative to the cemetery's other visual elements across different episodes. The Springfield Dam, which is a civic structure that appears as a background element in certain episodes and as a specific plot element in others, has been depicted in different configurations. Its height relative to the surrounding landscape, its specific architectural style, and its general visual character change between appearances. The episode that makes the dam a central plot element gives it more specific visual definition than it has in background appearances, which is a reasonable production decision but creates inconsistency when the dam's background appearances in other episodes don't match its featured version. Patty and Selma's apartment, which is one of the more frequently visited non-Simpson residences in the show, has had its specific layout changed across the series. The arrangement of their living space, the specific items on their walls, and the general visual character of the apartment as a domestic environment shift across the episodes set there. The specific photographs, licenses, and memorabilia related to MacGyver that characterize their space are not consistently present or consistently positioned. The Springfield Public Library, which Lisa visits with enough regularity to be a recurring setting, has been depicted in different configurations. Its book collection, visible in background shelves, changes between visits. The specific reference desk and its relationship to the entrance and the main reading area shift. The library's character as a slightly underfunded but fundamentally functional public institution is consistent across its appearances. Its specific physical layout is not. Homer's love of donuts, which is one of the show's most foundational characterizations, produces its own category of minor error in the tracking of exactly how many donuts Homer has eaten, is eating, or has available to him in any given scene. Donut counts that don't match between shots, boxes that are empty in one frame and full in the next, donuts that are half eaten in one shot and whole or fully consumed in the next. These are among the show's most cheerful errors, because they're errors that honor the spirit of Homer's relationship with food even while getting the specific accounting wrong. The Simpsons' garage, which is visible in certain exterior shots of the house, is used inconsistently as a space within the show's domestic geography. In some episodes, it functions as a genuine storage space, with specific contents that are relevant to the story. In others, it appears empty or with different contents. In still others, it is simply absent from the exterior shot of the house when the camera angle would logically include it. Whether the Simpson family actually uses their garage, what is in it at any given time, and how it relates to the rest of their domestic organization is a question the show has answered in incompatible ways. Dr. Hibbert's laugh, which is one of the show's most reliable and beloved character-specific traits, is deployed inconsistently across his appearances. In some scenes, he laughs at things that any reasonable reading of the character would produce laughter from. In other scenes, he laughs at things that are genuinely alarming patient prognoses that would not, in any other context, be comedy material, which is the joke. But there are scenes where his laugh appears in moments that don't clearly fit either the character logic or the joke logic, suggesting the laugh was added as a general character indicator rather than as a response to the specific scene. Groundskeeper Willie's accent, which is broadly Scottish and broadly consistent, has specific variations across episodes in terms of its intensity, its vocabulary, and the specific elements of Scottish dialect it incorporates. Willie in certain episodes sounds more exaggeratedly Scottish than Willie in other episodes. This partly reflects the natural variation in any voice performance across a long run, and partly reflects different directors and different scene contexts, pushing the character in slightly different directions. The Springfield Museum, which appears in several episodes, has had its collection, its layout, and its general character configured differently in different appearances. Its permanent collection, when visible, is not consistent between visits. The specific exhibits that are running in the background of museum scenes change between episodes in ways that go beyond normal curatorial rotation. Professor Frink's laboratory, when visited, has had its specific equipment, its layout, and its visual character changed across different episodes. The general character, a chaotic, heavily equipped scientific workspace, is consistent. The specific equipment and its arrangement is not. The characters who serve as Springfield's mayor's aides, security staff, and city officials form a background cast of minor characters whose specific faces, names, and relationships to Mayor Quimby are handled with episodic freedom. Characters who appear as specific named aides in one episode appear as generic background functionaries in another. Characters who are introduced as specific members of the mayor's staff don't persist across subsequent appearances in civic settings. The Springfield Police Department's specific configuration, the number of officers, the layout of the precinct, the relationship between the precinct and the jail is handled differently in different episodes. The jail cells have been depicted in significantly different configurations. The evidence room, the interrogation room, and the general workspace of the police department are not consistent between the episodes that feature them prominently. Kent Brockman's news set has changed meaningfully across the show's run. Its background screens, the specific configuration of his anchor desk, and the general visual design of his broadcast environment reflect both genuine evolution in news set design aesthetics and inconsistent production decisions about which version of the set to use in any given episode. The graphics that appear behind him during broadcasts are handled with variable specificity. Sometimes they're accurate representations of what the story he's covering would look like, and sometimes they're generic placeholders. The relationship between Channel 6 and the various media organizations that intersect with it, the print newspaper, the radio station, and the other television presences in Springfield is not consistently characterized. These organizations sometimes operate as though Springfield has a robust, independent media ecosystem. In other episodes, the media landscape of Springfield is treated as essentially a single outlet with Brockman at its center. The specific ownership relationships between these media organizations, when they're addressed at all, are not consistent. The Duff Beer Brewery and its relationship to the Duff brand's presence throughout Springfield is another source of inconsistency. The brewery is a specific Springfield institution, visited in the famous episode that reveals how Duff, Duff Light, and Duff Dry are all the same beer from the same pipe. Subsequent episodes reference Duff's availability and ubiquity in ways that are broadly consistent with this reveal. But the specific production details of the brewery and its relationship to the other elements of the Duff empire visible throughout Springfield are handled with variable specificity. The animation of smoke, fire, and liquid in The Simpsons, which are the most technically challenging elements to animate consistently, is subject to significant variation across the show's run, both in terms of how realistic these elements look and in terms of their specific physical behavior within scenes. The way fire spreads, the way liquid moves, and the way smoke disperses in different Springfield scenes reflect different animators making different choices about how to render these physical phenomena. This is expected and appropriate variation, but it means that Springfield fire behaves differently in different episodes. Springfield water moves differently, and Springfield smoke follows different rules. The Comet, the episode featuring a comet threatening Springfield, is one of the show's more memorable disaster scenarios, and the specific visual depiction of the comet across that episode's runtime is not entirely consistent. Its size relative to other objects in the frame changes between shots. Its trajectory, when visible, is not perfectly consistent with the trajectory implied by other shots in the same episode. These are production errors that are invisible at normal viewing speed and visible when the episode is watched frame by frame. One final observation, and perhaps the most quietly strange one in this entire catalog: there are moments in The Simpsons, not many, but enough to constitute a pattern where the animation goes very slightly wrong in a way that is almost right. Where a character's movement for a single frame is almost the correct movement but not quite. Where a background element is almost in the right position but shifted by a fraction. Where the color is almost the established color but slightly off. These moments are stranger than outright errors because they exist in the space between correct and incorrect. They suggest a process that was almost working, a production check that almost caught the problem, a hand that almost drew the right thing. They're the near misses of animation production, and they have a different quality than the clear errors. They feel, if you spend enough time with them, almost deliberate, almost like Springfield itself. Almost right, almost real, almost perfect, and more interesting for the almost. Springfield is an almost. It's the almost of a real town, the almost of real people, the almost of real life made into 30 minutes of animation that somehow, across 788 episodes and 36 years, has managed to feel more familiar than most real things. The errors are part of the almost. They always were. Number. Final addendum. The things we almost missed a last pass through Springfield. There is a specific pleasure in going back through something you've already examined and finding something new. Springfield rewards this kind of return. The show has always rewarded it: the background gags that only register on the third viewing, the throwaway line that becomes significant 2 seasons later, the expression on a minor character's face in a crowd scene that is funnier than anything in the foreground. So, here is one final pass. Not comprehensive, not organized, just the things that were almost missed, offered as a companion for the last quiet stretch of whatever hour this is. The Simpson children's ages on official documents within the show are inconsistent with each other and with the ages stated in dialogue across different episodes. When a form or official record requires an age for Bart, Lisa, or Maggie, the number written on that form is not always the number that previous episodes or subsequent dialogue would produce. These are brief glimpses of background text that most viewers never pause to read, but they're there, quietly contradicting the established facts and documents that supposedly represent official Springfield record. Homer's glasses. Homer does not regularly wear glasses, but there are episodes where he requires them for specific situations: reading small text, driving in certain conditions, attempting to appear more professional for a specific scene. The glasses that appear in these episodes are not always the same glasses. Their specific style, lens shape, and frame color change between the episodes where Homer temporarily becomes a glasses wearer. This inconsistency is invisible because the glasses are such occasional props that no viewer is tracking them between their rare appearances. The specific brand and model of Homer's bowling ball, which appears in the opening credits and in bowling-related episodes, is not consistent between those appearances. The ball that Homer bowls in the opening credit sequence is not described with enough detail to create strict continuity requirements, but the bowling ball that appears as a prop in episodes where bowling is specifically the subject has been depicted with different weight markings and different visual characteristics than the opening credits ball. Marge's recipe box, which appears in kitchen scenes as a reference element when cooking is relevant to the scene, has been shown with different contents in different episodes. The specific recipe cards visible inside it change. The box itself has been depicted in slightly different configurations. These are almost comically minor details, but they represent the general pattern of Springfield's domestic props having a fluid relationship with their own continuity. The specific weather of Springfield on any given day within an episode is occasionally inconsistent with the weather visible through the windows of the same space in other shots. A scene that establishes rain outside cuts to a shot through the same window that shows clear sky. A scene in bright sunlight has shots from different angles that suggest the light quality outside has changed. These weather inconsistencies are the result of different backgrounds being used for different angles of the same space, without checking that the outdoor conditions depicted are consistent. The number of cars in the Simpson family driveway changes between episodes and sometimes between scenes in the same episode. The pink family car is the consistent element. Other vehicles, a second car, Marge's vehicle in certain periods, borrowed or rented vehicles appear and disappear with episodic freedom. The specific art on the walls of different Springfield locations, the hospital, the school, the various offices and public spaces, is not tracked between that location's various appearances. The general institutional character of the art, generically inoffensive, specifically unpretentious, is consistent. The specific pieces change. Homer's wedding ring is visible in most scenes involving Homer's hands but is absent in others, without any narrative explanation for its absence. This is a common prop continuity issue in live-action production and an occasional one in animation, where the ring's presence or absence depends on whether the animator drawing Homer's hand in that particular shot included it. The Springfield Elementary School bell, which signals the transitions between class periods and defines the rhythm of the school day in school set episodes, is depicted with different sounds in different episodes. The bell is a functional story element, and its specific sound is not the kind of detail that most productions track carefully. But for a show with as devoted a fan base as The Simpsons, even the sound of the school bell is the subject of comparative analysis. The specific animals visible in Springfield's outdoor spaces, birds in trees, squirrels on lawns, the various fauna that populate the backgrounds of exterior scenes are not tracked between episodes. The same Springfield park or street can have different animal life in the background across its various appearances. This is perhaps the most defensible category of background inconsistency in the entire catalog, because real outdoor spaces genuinely do have different animals in them on different days. But it's worth noting, in a survey of this thoroughness, that Springfield's fauna is as inconsistent as everything else in Springfield. The water tower? Springfield has a water tower that is visible in certain establishing shots of the town, and that has been used as a location in a handful of episodes. Its specific visual design, its color, its structural configuration, whether it has any text or insignia on it, its size relative to surrounding buildings changes across its appearances. The water tower is a background landmark that most viewers would identify by general shape rather than specific details, which makes its inconsistency less jarring than inconsistency in more prominent landmarks. But it's there, quietly being a different water tower in different episodes. And then there is this. In a handful of episodes across the show's run, there are frames where, in the far background of an exterior Springfield shot, a building or landmark is visible that doesn't match the established layout of Springfield, as depicted in episodes where the geography is more specifically established. Buildings appear on streets where established maps of Springfield would place them in different locations. Landmarks are visible from angles that would be impossible given their stated locations. These are not the grand geographical inconsistencies of Springfield's impossible relationship with mountains and oceans and neighboring states. They are the small, quiet, single-frame inconsistencies of a background artist working from a general impression of Springfield rather than from the specific episode's geography. Springfield has many thousands of those frames. Most of them are right, some of them are slightly wrong, all of them are Springfield. That's the whole catalog. Not truly whole, there's always more. There's always another one. There will be another one found tomorrow by someone watching an episode they've seen 100 times in the particular quality of attention that late-night watching produces. But this is the catalog for tonight. This is the Springfield we've been through together, the wrong and the almost right, and the specifically flawed and the lovingly imperfect. It was good to be here. It's always good to be here. Springfield will be here when you come back. It won't be exactly the same Springfield, it never quite is, but it will be close enough. It will be recognizable. It will feel like home. That's the whole point. That's always been the whole point. Number. A note on watching. One more thing before we're done. Something that doesn't fit anywhere in the organized sections but belongs here, at the end, when everything else has been said. The act of watching The Simpsons is itself a kind of continuity error, in the way that all sustained engagement with a long work of art eventually is. You are not the same person who watched the first episode. The show is not the same show it was in its first season. The relationship between the two of you has accumulated across however many years you've been watching, and that accumulated relationship is a thing the show never anticipated and could never fully account for. You have memories of watching specific episodes. Those memories are not the episodes. The memories are the episodes as processed by a specific person in a specific moment, and those moments are gone, and the episodes remain, and the relationship between what you remember and what the show actually contains is its own ongoing source of gentle inconsistency. You remember a line being funnier than it is when you watch it now. You remember a scene being sadder. You remember a character being different. These aren't errors in the show. They're errors in memory, which is to say they're the most human category of error there is. Springfield has been wrong about itself for 36 years. So have you. So has everyone who loves it. That's the thing about a show that runs long enough. It outlasts the people who first made it and the people who first watched it. It becomes a shared object, held simultaneously by everyone who has ever watched it, and the version held in memory by any given person is not quite the same as the version in anyone else's memory, and none of those memory versions are quite the same as the show itself. Springfield exists in 788 episodes and in however many millions of memories. And all of those versions contradict each other a little, and all of them are Springfield. That's the final error. The one that can't be corrected. The one that gets worse. Which is to say, better, the longer the show runs and the longer we watch. We've been misremembering Springfield since 1989. We'll keep misremembering it until we can't anymore. And in the space between the show as it is and the show as we remember it, something real lives. Something that isn't in any single episode but exists in the aggregate of all of them. Plus all of us, plus all the time we've spent in that yellow town with its impossible geography and its ageless family and its cracked cooling towers and its beautiful, unresolvable, endlessly generative imperfection. That's the real Springfield, the one that exists in the error between the show and the memory of the show. And if you're still here, eyes heavy, the screen soft in the dark, somewhere between one episode and sleep, you're in it. You're in the real Springfield right now. Stay as long as you need.